Hello everyone. Welcome to Mr. Midnight True Crime Stories. I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep. So before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. There's a peculiar quality to danger that most people never understand until it's too late. We imagine threats as loud, obvious, dramatic. The stranger in the parking lot, the broken window in the night, the masked figure in our nightmares. We spend our lives looking over our shoulders at shadows while the real danger sits across from us at the dinner table. It shares our bed. It knows our routines, our fears, our weaknesses. It has a key to our front door. Violence, when it finally arrives, rarely announces itself with fanfare. There's no ominous soundtrack, no warning label, no flashing red lights. Instead, it emerges from the fabric of ordinary life, woven so tightly into normalcy that we mistake it for love, for duty, for family. The most dangerous people aren't lurking in dark alleys. They're the ones who know exactly how you take your coffee in the morning. This isn't a story about monsters. Monsters are easy to identify, easy to fear, easy to avoid. This is a story about people. People who seemed perfectly normal, perfectly trustworthy, perfectly safe. People who were supposed to protect, to cherish, to care. People who wore the masks of respectability so well that no one thought to look beneath. What you're about to hear spans countries and decades, different lives and different circumstances, but beneath the surface, there's a pattern. A terrible, predictable pattern that repeats itself over and over because we refuse to see it. Because seeing it would mean acknowledging that safety is an illusion, that trust can be a weapon, that the people closest to us have the power to destroy us completely. Every case begins the same way. Someone trusted the wrong person and paid for it with their life. But trust isn't given randomly. It's earned through proximity, through familiarity, through the slow accumulation of ordinary moments that build into something that feels unshakable. That's what makes betrayal so devastating. It doesn't come from strangers. It comes from the people we never thought to doubt. The house stood at the end of Maple Ridge Road, a two-story colonial with white siding and black shutters that had been there for 40 years. In a town where everyone knew everyone else's business. The Morrison family was unremarkable in the best possible way. David Morrison taught chemistry at the regional high school. His wife, Patricia, managed the books for her brother's construction company. They attended church on Sundays, hosted neighborhood barbecues in the summer, and never missed a PTA meeting. Their daughter, Emma, was 17 that autumn. She had her mother's dark hair and her father's serious eyes, the kind of girl who teachers described as mature for her age, responsible, focused. She played violin in the school orchestra, maintained a 4.0 grade point average, and had already been accepted to 3 prestigious universities. On paper, Emma Morrison was exactly the kind of daughter every parent hoped to raise. But paper doesn't show you what happens behind closed doors. The call came into the county dispatch center at 6:42 on a Tuesday morning. A neighbor had noticed that the Morrisons' newspapers were piling up on the front porch, that the lights inside the house had been on for 2 days straight, that no one was answering the door. In a small town, these details matter. They mean something's wrong. When officers arrived, they found the front door unlocked. Inside, the house was quiet in a way that felt deliberately empty, like a held breath. The television in the living room was still on, playing the morning news to no one. Coffee cups sat on the kitchen counter, partially filled, the liquid inside gone cold days ago. David and Patricia Morrison were in their bedroom upstairs. They'd been dead for at least 72 hours. The scene was almost peaceful, if you didn't look too closely. They were both in bed, lying side by side as if they'd simply fallen asleep and never woken up. Patricia's reading glasses were still on the nightstand. David's slippers were lined up neatly beside the bed. There were no signs of struggle, no forced entry, no indication of violence. Just two people who had gone to bed one night and would never see another morning. The initial assumption was carbon monoxide poisoning, perhaps a faulty furnace or a gas leak. It was the kind of tragedy that seemed to make sense, the kind that allowed people to feel sad without feeling unsafe. Accidents happen. Terrible, unavoidable accidents that could strike anyone. But when the medical examiner arrived, he noticed something that didn't fit the carbon monoxide narrative. The body showed signs of lividity patterns that suggested they'd been moved after death. Not dramatically, just slightly repositioned, carefully arranged. And there was something else, a faint chemical smell that lingered in the air, something that didn't belong in a bedroom at all. Toxicology reports would take weeks, but the investigation couldn't wait. Officers began the process of piecing together the Morrison family's final days, talking to neighbors, colleagues, friends. Everyone said the same things. They were a nice family. Quiet. Private. No problems that anyone knew about. Except Emma was missing. Her car was gone from the driveway. Her phone went straight to voicemail. Her room looked untouched, bed made with hospital corners, textbooks stacked precisely on her desk, but her laptop was missing. So was her backpack. So were some of her clothes. The narrative shifted immediately. Missing daughter, dead parents, no signs of forced entry. In the cold mathematics of criminal investigation, the pieces were already arranging themselves into a story that no one wanted to believe. But belief has never been a requirement for truth. Emma's best friend, Rachel Chun, was the one who finally broke. She'd been holding on to secrets for months. The kind of secrets that felt harmless when they were just between friends. The kind that became unbearable when police officers were asking questions in an interview room. Emma had been seeing someone. Not casually dating someone her own age, but involved with someone older, someone her parents would never approve of. A 24-year-old line cook named Marcus who worked at a restaurant 2 towns over. They'd met at a poetry reading at the community college, which Emma had lied about attending, telling her parents she was at orchestra practice. Rachel described how Emma had changed over the past 6 months. How she'd become secretive, defensive, how she'd started talking about her parents differently. Not with the typical teenage frustration, but with something harder, colder. She'd stopped calling them mom and dad, started referring to them as Patricia and David, as if creating distance through language. Emma had told Rachel that her parents were suffocating her, that they controlled every aspect of her life, monitored her phone, tracked her location, made decisions about her future without consulting her. That she couldn't breathe in that house, couldn't be herself, couldn't exist as anything other than their perfect daughter. Rachel had sympathized. What teenager doesn't feel misunderstood by their parents? What 17-year-old doesn't dream of freedom, of being taken seriously, of making their own choices? But then Emma had said something that Rachel couldn't stop thinking about now, something that had seemed like typical dramatic exaggeration at the time. She'd said that sometimes she felt like she'd never escape unless something drastic happened. That her parents would never let her go, never let her live her own life. Not unless they couldn't stop her anymore. The investigation moved quickly after that. Phone records showed that Emma had been in contact with Marcus constantly, hundreds of texts and calls in the weeks before her parents died. The content of those messages painted a picture of escalating desperation. Emma had wanted to drop out of the university she'd been accepted to and move in with Marcus. Her parents had forbidden it, had threatened to cut her off completely if she continued the relationship. There had been confrontations, screaming matches, ultimatums delivered on both sides. In one message, Emma had written that she wished her parents would just disappear so she could finally be free. In another, Marcus had responded that maybe there were ways to make that happen. The toxicology reports came back faster than expected, pushed through as a priority once Emma became a suspect rather than a missing person. David and Patricia Morrison had died from acute poisoning. The substance found in their systems was something called sodium fluoroacetate, a compound most people had never heard of, but that was devastatingly effective and difficult to detect. It's also a chemical commonly used in school chemistry labs. Emma's father had taught chemistry for 20 years. He had access to controlled substances, kept under lock and key in the school's storage facility. Except the log showed that a bottle of sodium fluoroacetate had gone missing 3 weeks before the Morrisons died, and the signature on the checkout sheet was David Morrison's, even though he'd been at a conference in Boston that day. Someone had forged his signature. Someone who knew his handwriting well enough to make it convincing. The pieces were falling into place with the kind of horrible inevitability that made everyone involved wish they could go back and change something, anything, to make it turn out differently. Emma and Marcus were found 4 days later at a motel outside of Albany, paying cash for their room, eating takeout, and planning their next move. When officers knocked on the door, Emma answered it wearing one of Marcus's t-shirts, looking younger than 17, looking frightened and defiant in equal measure. The interrogation tapes would later become a subject of intense scrutiny. Emma sat across from Detective Sarah Walsh in a small room with fluorescent lights that made everyone look sick. She didn't ask for a lawyer immediately. That was her first mistake. Her second was thinking she could explain her way out of what she'd done. Detective Walsh had been doing this job for 15 years, long enough to recognize when someone was caught between what they'd imagined would happen and the crushing reality of what actually had. Emma kept shifting between two versions of herself: the mature, articulate teenager who could discuss moral philosophy, and the frightened child who hadn't fully grasped that her parents were never coming back. "They didn't understand me," Emma said, her voice steady at first. "They never tried to understand me. They just wanted me to be this perfect version of their daughter, someone who would make them look good, someone who would do exactly what they planned for my entire life." Detective Walsh nodded, didn't interrupt. Let the silence do the work. "I loved Marcus. I still love him. But they couldn't see past his age, past his job, past all these superficial things that don't actually matter. They told me I was throwing my life away, that I was being manipulated, that I didn't know what real love was." Emma's hands were trembling now, but they were the ones trying to control me. They were the ones who wouldn't let me make my own choices. "So you decided to make a permanent choice," Detective Walsh said quietly. Emma's face crumpled then, and for a moment, she looked exactly like what she was. A teenager who had made a decision she couldn't take back. "I didn't think it would be like this. Marcus said it would be quick, that they wouldn't suffer. He said we'd be free and no one would know, and we could start over somewhere else." The confession spilled out in fragments, disjointed and defensive. Marcus had suggested at first, casually, like a dark joke that gradually became less like a joke and more like a possibility. Emma had been the one with access to her father's school lab. She'd forged his signature, stolen the chemical, brought it home hidden in her backpack like contraband. They'd planned it for weeks. Emma had researched dosages, methods of administration, how long it would take. She'd chosen a night when she knew her parents would be tired, when they'd take the sleeping pills they sometimes used for insomnia. She'd crushed the sodium fluoroacetate into powder, mixed it into their water glasses, and waited. She'd heard them go to bed around 10. By midnight, the house was silent. By morning, Emma knew they were dead, but she'd waited another day before leaving, trying to make it look like she'd been gone when it happened, trying to establish distance between herself and the crime. It hadn't worked. It was never going to work. Marcus told a different story when they questioned him separately. He claimed Emma had been obsessed with getting rid of her parents, that she'd talked about it constantly, that he'd tried to talk her out of it, but she'd been determined. He painted himself as a concerned boyfriend who'd gotten in over his head with a disturbed teenager. The jury didn't believe him. The evidence was too clear, the planning too mutual. Both of them had researched poisons online. Both of them had discussed the murder in texts that they'd been stupid enough not to delete. Both of them had fled together, had spent the days after the murder making plans for their future together. The trial lasted 3 weeks. Emma's defense attorney tried to argue that she'd been manipulated by an older man, that she'd been coerced, that her judgment had been compromised. The prosecution presented a different narrative. A teenager who decided that her freedom was worth more than her parents' lives, who'd cold-bloodedly planned and executed their murder, who'd shown no remorse until she'd been caught. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. Guilty on 2 counts of first-degree murder. Emma Morrison was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Marcus received the same. They were separated immediately after sentencing, sent to different facilities, forbidden from any contact. The great love story that had seemed worth killing for ended in 2 separate prison cells hundreds of miles apart. Rachel Chen testified at the trial. She talked about the Emma she'd known, the friend who'd been funny and smart and passionate about music and literature. She talked about watching that person slowly disappear, replaced by someone she didn't recognize, someone who talked about her parents like they were obstacles to be overcome rather than people who loved her. On the stand, Rachel had cried. "I should have told someone," she said. "When she started talking about them like they were the enemy, I should have said something to somebody. But I thought it was just normal teenage stuff. I thought she was just venting. I didn't think she was serious." But Emma had been serious. Deadly serious. The house on Maple Ridge Road sat empty for 2 years before it was finally sold. The new owners gutted the interior, changed everything, tried to erase the history that had soaked into the walls. But people in town still called it the Morrison house, still looked at it with a mixture of sadness and unease when they drove past. Emma's violin sat in an evidence locker for months before it was released to her maternal grandmother, the only family member who still claimed any connection to her. The grandmother never visited Emma in prison. Some betrayals are too complete for forgiveness. In the years that followed, psychologists and criminologists would study the case, trying to understand how a straight-A student with no history of violence could commit such a brutal crime. They'd point to the controlling environment, the forbidden relationship, the collision between parental expectations and adolescent autonomy. They'd write papers with titles like Familicide as Liberation, a case study in adolescent moral reasoning. But all the analysis in the world couldn't change the fundamental truth. Emma Morrison had decided that her freedom mattered more than her parents' lives, and she'd acted on that decision with chilling premeditation. The why might be complicated, but the what was devastatingly simple. Two people who'd loved their daughter, who'd wanted the best for her, who'd made mistakes in how they showed that love, had died because they'd trusted the wrong person. They'd trusted their own child, and that trust had killed them. The story should have ended there, with Emma and Marcus in prison, with justice served in the cold mechanical way that the legal system provides. But some stories don't end cleanly. They echo. 3 years into her sentence, Emma gave an interview to a true crime podcast. She'd agreed to talk, she said, because she wanted people to understand that she wasn't a monster. That what she'd done came from a place of desperation, of feeling trapped, of being 17 and convinced that her entire life was being decided by people who didn't care what she wanted. The interviewer asked if she regretted it. Emma had paused for a long time before answering. "I regret that it had to happen that way," she'd finally said. "I regret that they couldn't just let me live my own life. I regret that they pushed me to a point where I felt like I had no other choice." Notice what's missing from that answer. Notice what she never said. She never said she regretted killing them. The interview sparked outrage and fascination in equal measure. Some people saw Emma as a victim of parental overreach, a cautionary tale about the dangers of controlling children too tightly. Others saw her as exactly what she was, a murderer trying to rewrite history, trying to paint herself as justified, trying to make her parents' deaths their own fault. David Morrison's former students created a memorial scholarship in his name. Patricia Morrison's colleagues donated money to a domestic violence charity in her honor, though Patricia had never been a victim of domestic violence. But people needed to do something, to create meaning from senselessness, to make the deaths matter beyond the simple fact of violence. Emma's case became a talking point in discussions about teen crime, about parental rights, about where the line exists between appropriate boundaries and harmful control. But lost in all those discussions were two simple facts. David and Patricia Morrison had loved their daughter, and their daughter had killed them anyway. Because sometimes love isn't enough. Sometimes trust is just the opening that allows someone to destroy you. And sometimes the danger doesn't come from strangers or criminals or people you should have known to fear. Sometimes it comes from the person you raised, the person you'd have died to protect, the person who decided that freedom was worth the price of your life. The house on Maple Ridge Road still stands. The new owners have children of their own now. Teenagers who walk past Emma's old room without knowing what happened there, who eat dinner in a kitchen where a daughter once mixed poison into her parents' water. Life goes on. It always does. But for David and Patricia Morrison, life ended in their own bed, in their own home, killed by their own daughter. They'd trusted her completely, right up until the moment that trust became fatal. And that's the thing about trust. It's only as reliable as the person you give it to. The medical research facility occupied 3 floors of a glass and steel building in a suburban office park, the kind of place that looked expensive and impressive without being particularly memorable. Dr. Catherine Reeves had worked there for 8 years, managing clinical trials and overseeing compliance with federal regulations. Her colleagues described her as brilliant, meticulous, someone who never made mistakes. She was also dying, though no one knew it yet. Catherine's husband, Thomas, was an architect with a successful firm downtown. They'd been married for 12 years, together for 15. On the surface, their life looked exactly like what Catherine had planned when she was a medical student dreaming about her future. The prestigious career, the beautiful home in a good neighborhood, the appearance of having everything figured out. Appearances, as always, were deceiving. The first sign that something was wrong came on a Wednesday afternoon when Thomas didn't show up for a lunch meeting with a client. His assistant called Catherine, apologetic and worried. Thomas was never late, never missed appointments without explanation. Catherine told her not to worry, that he'd probably just lost track of time. But there was something in her voice that the assistant would remember later as strange. Not concern exactly. Something closer to resignation. Thomas was found in his car in the parking garage of his office building. The engine was off, the windows were up, and he appeared to be sleeping. But he wasn't sleeping. He was dead, and he'd been dead for several hours. The initial assumption was a heart attack. Thomas was 42, in good health as far as anyone knew, but sudden cardiac events happened. They were tragic and shocking, but they happened. The medical examiner ordered a standard autopsy, expecting to find blocked arteries or an undiagnosed heart defect. What he found instead was a toxicology report that didn't make sense. Thomas Reeves had died from acute poisoning. The substance in his system was something called potassium chloride, administered in quantities far beyond what could occur naturally. It had stopped his heart within minutes, creating exactly the appearance of a cardiac event. Potassium chloride is a common substance in medical facilities. It's used in lethal injection protocols. It's also carefully controlled, logged, and monitored because of how dangerous it can be. The investigation shifted immediately. This wasn't a tragic medical event. This was murder. Catherine Reeves sat in the detective's office with perfect posture, her hands folded in her lap, her face carefully composed. She was wearing a navy blue suit and pearl earrings, looking every inch the successful professional woman. When Detective Marcus Chun asked how she was holding up, she gave him a sad smile and said she was trying to stay strong. "When was the last time you saw your husband?" Detective Chun asked. "Tuesday morning, before I left for work. He was having coffee in the kitchen. He seemed fine, totally normal." Catherine's voice was steady, controlled. "I still can't believe he's gone. Did he have any health problems you were aware of?" "No. Thomas was healthy. He went to the gym 3 times a week. Watch what he ate." "This doesn't make any sense." Detective Chin nodded, made notes. "We need to ask you some questions about the substance found in your husband's system. Potassium chloride. Are you familiar with it?" Catherine didn't hesitate. "Of course. We use it at the research facility. It's common in medical settings." "Do you have access to it?" "I have access to the storage areas where it's kept, yes. But everything is logged. There are protocols." She met his eyes directly. "Are you suggesting someone poisoned Thomas?" "The toxicology report indicates that's a possibility we need to explore." Catherine's reaction was perfect. Just the right amount of shock, confusion, and growing horror as she processed what he was implying. "You think someone at my work might have done this?" "Someone I work with." "We're exploring all possibilities," Detective Chun said carefully. What he didn't say yet, what he was holding back, was that they'd already checked the logs at Catherine's research facility. A vial of potassium chloride had gone missing 3 weeks earlier. The theft had been reported, investigated internally, and ultimately written off as a record-keeping error because there was no indication of where it had gone. But Detective Chun was very interested in the timing. Catherine left the police station after 2 hours of questioning, still playing the role of the grieving widow perfectly. She drove home to the house she'd shared with Thomas, walked through rooms that suddenly felt too large and too empty, and sat on the couch they'd picked out together 6 years ago. Then she poured herself a glass of wine and allowed herself to feel relief. The investigation into Thomas Reeves's death proceeded methodically. Detectives interviewed his colleagues, his friends, his family. They built a picture of his life, looking for enemies, for conflicts, for anyone who might have wanted him dead. What they found instead was a different kind of story. Thomas's business partner mentioned, almost in passing, that Thomas had seemed distracted lately, that he'd been taking phone calls in private, stepping out of meetings, arriving late, and leaving early. When pressed, the partner admitted he'd wondered if Thomas was having an affair, though he'd never had any proof. Thomas's sister said he'd seemed unhappy in his marriage for years, but that he'd never talked about leaving. He and Catherine had this perfect life on paper, she said. But I don't think either of them was actually happy. They were just going through the motions. And Thomas's best friend from college, after some hesitation, admitted that Thomas had confided in him about Catherine's drinking, that it had gotten worse over the past 2 years, that she was coming home drunk most nights, that Thomas had found hidden bottles throughout the house. He was worried about her, the friend said. But he didn't know how to help someone who didn't think they had a problem. The narrative was shifting again. Not a random murder, not a crime of passion, but something more calculated. Something that required planning and access and a willingness to destroy someone slowly, carefully, in a way that looked like natural causes. Detectives started digging into Catherine's life beyond the surface. They found credit card statements showing significant debt, expensive dinners, hotel rooms, purchases that didn't match up with the life she appeared to be living. They found prescription records indicating she'd been prescribed anti-anxiety medication and sleeping pills from multiple doctors, a pattern that suggested doctor shopping. And they found something else. Text messages on a phone that Catherine had thought she'd deleted thoroughly enough. Messages to a number that belonged to a man named Alex Porter, a pharmaceutical sales representative who visited Catherine's research facility monthly. The messages went back 18 months. They started professional, discussing medications and trial protocols. Then they became friendly, then flirtatious, then explicit. Catherine had been having an affair for over a year, and she'd been careless enough to leave a trail. But the affair wasn't enough for an arrest. Plenty of people have affairs without committing murder. What detectives needed was evidence connecting Catherine directly to Thomas's poisoning. They got it from an unexpected source. One of Catherine's research assistants, a woman named Jennifer Park, came forward 3 weeks into the investigation. She'd been wrestling with her conscience, trying to decide if what she'd seen actually meant anything or if she was reading too much into it. Jennifer described an incident from a month before Thomas died. She'd been working late, organizing supply closets and updating inventory logs. Catherine had been in the building too, which wasn't unusual. She often worked late. But what was unusual was that Catherine had been in the storage area where controlled substances were kept, and she'd seemed startled when Jennifer walked in. She had a syringe in her hand, Jennifer said. She explained that she was just checking inventory, making sure everything matched the logs. But the thing is, we'd just done a full inventory audit the week before. There was no reason for her to be checking anything. Jennifer had made a note of it mentally but hadn't reported it because Catherine was her boss, because it seemed insignificant, because questioning a superior's actions felt risky. But now, knowing what had happened to Thomas, knowing about the missing potassium chloride, the memory took on new significance. The security footage from the research facility became crucial evidence. It showed Catherine entering the controlled substance storage area on 3 separate occasions in the weeks before Thomas died, each time alone, each time staying for only a few minutes, each time at odd hours when few other staff members were present. The footage didn't show her taking anything, but it showed opportunity. When confronted with this evidence, Catherine's carefully maintained composure began to crack. She hired an attorney, stopped talking to detectives, and retreated into the kind of silence that looks like guilt to everyone watching. The prosecution built their case piece by piece. They presented evidence of Catherine's drinking problem, her mounting debts, her affair with Alex Porter. They showed that her marriage to Thomas had been deteriorating for years, that they discussed divorce but never followed through. They demonstrated that Catherine had both the knowledge and the access to obtain potassium chloride, and that she would have known exactly how to administer it to cause a death that looked natural. The motive was simple. Thomas's life insurance policy was worth $2 million. Catherine was the sole beneficiary. A divorce would have meant splitting assets, explaining her debts and her drinking, losing the appearance of success she'd worked so hard to maintain. But if Thomas died unexpectedly, Catherine would get everything and be free to start over with Alex. Except it hadn't worked out that way. Alex Porter, when questioned, had a very different story about their relationship. He admitted to the affair but claimed that Catherine had been the aggressive one, that she'd pursued him relentlessly, that he'd tried to end things multiple times, but she'd threatened to report him to his company if he cut off contact. She was obsessed with the idea of us being together, Alex testified. She talked about Thomas like he was this obstacle she needed to get around. I thought she meant divorce. I didn't realize she was talking about murder. The jury heard testimony from medical experts about how potassium chloride works, how it can stop a heart, how it's nearly impossible to detect without specific toxicology tests. They heard from Catherine's colleagues about her brilliant mind, her attention to detail, her ability to solve complex problems, all qualities that made her excellent at her job and perfectly capable of planning a murder. They also heard from Thomas's family, who described a man who'd been kind and generous, who'd loved his wife even when their marriage was failing, who'd never imagined that the person he'd trusted most in the world was planning to kill him. Catherine's defense attorney tried to create reasonable doubt. He pointed out that other people had access to the controlled substance storage area, that the missing vial could have been taken by anyone, that an affair didn't equal murder. He presented Catherine as a woman struggling with addiction who'd made mistakes in her personal life, but who wasn't a killer. The jury didn't buy it. The evidence was too compelling, the pattern too clear. Catherine Reeves had used her medical knowledge to murder her husband in a way that should have been undetectable. She'd failed only because the medical examiner had been thorough enough to order the right toxicology tests. The verdict came back after 2 days of deliberation. Guilty of first-degree murder. Catherine showed no emotion when the verdict was read. She stood perfectly still, her face composed, looking like she was listening to a presentation at a medical conference rather than hearing the end of her freedom. Only her hands betrayed her, gripping the edge of the defense table hard enough that her knuckles turned white. The sentencing hearing was brief. The judge noted that Catherine had betrayed not only her husband's trust, but also the trust placed in medical professionals who have access to dangerous substances. He sentenced her to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Catherine was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs, still wearing her professional clothing, still maintaining the appearance of control. But everyone who watched her leave knew they were seeing the end of a carefully constructed facade. The research facility where Catherine had worked conducted a complete review of their security protocols after her conviction. They installed additional cameras, implemented stricter logging procedures, and required dual authorization for accessing controlled substances. They were closing the barn door after the horse had already escaped, but it made them feel like they were doing something. Thomas's family established a foundation in his name that funded addiction treatment programs. They never mentioned Catherine in their public statements, never spoke her name. She'd become a footnote in Thomas's story, the person who'd ended his life, but who didn't deserve to be remembered as part of his legacy. Alex Porter lost his job and moved to a different state. He gave one interview to a local news station in which he described Catherine as manipulative and dangerous, someone who'd seemed normal until suddenly she wasn't. He claimed he'd been a victim too, though no one seemed particularly sympathetic to that argument. The house where Catherine and Thomas had lived together sold quickly despite its history. The new owners never knew that someone had been murdered there, or that the wife who'd smiled at neighbors and hosted dinner parties had been planning her husband's death while making small talk about property values and school districts. In prison, Catherine earned a reputation for being quiet and compliant. She worked in the library, attended addiction recovery meetings, and never discussed her case. Other inmates said she seemed like she didn't quite belong there, that she carried herself like she was temporarily displaced rather than permanently incarcerated. A journalist tried to interview her 2 years into her sentence. Catherine declined. Through her attorney, she issued a brief statement saying that she maintained her innocence and that the investigation had been flawed from the beginning. She never elaborated on that claim, never provided evidence of what had been overlooked or who else might have been responsible, because there was no one else. There had only ever been Catherine, using her intelligence and her access and her intimate knowledge of her husband's routines to commit what she believed would be the perfect crime. The thing about perfect crimes is that they only stay perfect if no one looks closely enough. Catherine had counted on Thomas's death being ruled natural causes. She'd counted on her medical knowledge making her smarter than everyone else. She'd counted on no one suspecting the grieving widow. She'd been wrong about all of it. The case became a teaching example in forensic pathology courses. Medical examiners learned from it, refined their protocols, became more suspicious of deaths that seemed too convenient. In that sense, Thomas's death prevented other murders, saved other lives. But it didn't bring Thomas back. His sister visited his grave every year on his birthday. She'd stand there for a while, talking to him like he could hear her, telling him about her life and her children and all the things he was missing. She never mentioned Catherine. Some people didn't deserve to be part of the conversation. Trust, in the end, had been Thomas's fatal mistake. He'd trusted that his wife wouldn't hurt him, that their marriage, even if it was failing, still meant something. He'd trusted that the person who'd promised to love him in sickness and in health wouldn't be the one to cause his death. But Catherine had seen their marriage differently. She'd seen it as a trap she needed to escape, a life that no longer served her purposes, a problem with a permanent solution. and she'd had the knowledge and the opportunity to make that solution a reality. The medical community struggled with the implications. If someone as respected and accomplished as Dr. Catherine Reeves could use her expertise to commit murder, how many others might be doing the same? How many deaths ruled as natural causes were actually carefully planned homicides? The answer was unknowable and terrifying. Catherine had been caught only because of a thorough autopsy and a medical examiner who'd ordered the right tests. If Thomas had been cremated immediately, if the toxicology panel had been less comprehensive, if any number of small details had gone differently, Catherine would still be free. She'd come within a margin of error of getting away with murder. That's what expertise provides. Not just the ability to save lives, but the knowledge of how to end them in ways that don't raise suspicion. Medical professionals, chemists, pharmacists, anyone with access to controlled substances and understanding of how they work carries a unique kind of power. Catherine had abused that power spectacularly. In the years following her conviction, a few of her former colleagues admitted that they'd noticed signs of her deterioration. The drinking had been more obvious than they'd acknowledged at the time. Her work had become sloppy in small ways. She'd been defensive when questioned, irritable, absent. But none of them had imagined she was capable of murder. She'd been too professional, too controlled, too smart to do something so drastic. Except intelligence doesn't prevent crime. Sometimes it just makes the planning more sophisticated. Catherine Reeves had planned her husband's murder with the same meticulous attention to detail she'd brought to her medical research. She'd considered variables, minimized risks, and executed her plan with precision. She'd failed only because perfection doesn't exist, because even the most careful plans have flaws, because somewhere in the chain of evidence and investigation, someone had been paying attention. Thomas died trusting the wrong person. He died believing his wife was someone she hadn't been for years. He died in his car, alone, his heart stopped by a substance his wife had stolen from her workplace and administered with clinical detachment. The horror wasn't in the method. The horror was in the calculation, the cold decision that his life mattered less than her freedom, that 12 years of marriage could be erased with a syringe full of poison. Catherine had turned her knowledge into a weapon. She'd used her expertise to destroy the person who'd trusted her most. And that's the thing about trust in intimate relationships. It creates vulnerability. It means letting someone close enough to hurt you. It means believing that the person who knows your routines and your weaknesses won't use that knowledge against you. Thomas had believed that, right up until his heart stopped beating. The festival was in its third day when it happened. Downtown was crowded with families, tourists, street vendors selling food that smelled like cinnamon and frying oil. Music poured from speakers set up on every corner, competing with each other, creating a chaos of sound that people seemed to love. Children ran between adult legs, their faces painted like tigers and butterflies. Couples walked hand in hand, stopping to look at art displays and handmade jewelry. It was the kind of scene that should have been completely safe. Public, visible, full of witnesses. The kind of place where violence shouldn't intrude because there were too many people watching, too many eyes that would see. But violence doesn't respect those boundaries. James Chun was 23 years old. He worked as a paralegal at a downtown law firm, lived in an apartment with 2 roommates, and was saving money to go to law school. He'd come to the festival with his younger sister, Maya, who was visiting from college. They'd spent the afternoon eating overpriced festival food and laughing at the street performers. Maya had taken dozens of photos on her phone, already planning how she'd share them with friends. They were walking down 4th Street when James noticed the group of men ahead of them. There were 5 of them, moving together in a way that felt territorial, taking up more space on the sidewalk than they needed. James stepped slightly to the side, pulling Maya with him, giving them room to pass. It should have been enough. One of the men made eye contact with James. It lasted maybe 2 seconds, just a brief acknowledgement that they occupied the same space. James looked away immediately, trying to signal that he wasn't interested in any kind of confrontation. He'd grown up in this city. He knew how to read situations, how to avoid trouble. But sometimes avoiding trouble isn't possible. The man said something to his friends. James couldn't hear it over the festival noise, but he saw them react, saw them turn to look at him. There was laughter, the kind that has edges to it. James kept walking, pulling Maya along faster now. "What's wrong?" Maya asked. "Nothing. Just want to get somewhere with more people." Except they were already somewhere with more people. The street was packed with festival goers. But James had learned that crowds don't always mean safety. Sometimes they just mean more witnesses to your humiliation, or your beating, or worse. The group followed them. James could feel it without looking back, that sense of being tracked, of becoming prey. He tried to lose them by turning down a side street, but the men followed, their footsteps getting closer. Maya was scared now, holding onto James's arm tightly. "James, what's happening? Just stay close to me." They turned another corner, heading back toward the main festival area where there would be police, security, people who might intervene. But the side street they'd chosen was less crowded, lined with shops that had closed early for the holiday. The festival sounds felt distant now, muffled. The men caught up with them near an alley between two buildings. "Hey," one of them called out. "Where you going so fast?" James stopped, turned around, kept his voice calm. "Just heading back to the festival. No problem here. Looked like you had a problem with us back there." The speaker was tall, maybe 19 or 20, wearing a red basketball jersey. His friends spread out behind him in a loose semicircle. "I don't have any problem with anyone. We're just trying to enjoy the festival." "That right?" Red jersey stepped closer. "'Cause it seemed like you were giving me some kind of look." This was how it started. James had seen it before. This manufactured disrespect. This creation of offense where none existed. It was a pretext, a way to justify what they'd already decided to do. The specific details didn't matter. The look, the bumping, the wrong words, it was all interchangeable. What mattered was establishing dominance, proving something to each other, feeling powerful. Maya was crying quietly beside him. James squeezed her hand, tried to communicate without words that she needed to stay calm. That escalating this would only make it worse. "I wasn't giving you any kind of look," James said. "We're just trying to get back to the festival. That's it." One of the other men spoke up. "I think you're lying. I think you were disrespecting my boy here." James could see where this was going. There was no right answer, no combination of words that would defuse the situation. They decided he was a target before they'd even spoken to him. Maybe because he looked like he had money. Maybe because he was Asian in a neighborhood where that made him an outsider. Maybe just because he was there and they were bored and angry about something that had nothing to do with him. The reasons didn't matter. The outcome was already written. "Look," James tried one more time. "I'm here with my sister. We don't want any trouble. If I disrespected you somehow, I apologize. Can we just go?" Red jersey smiled, and there was no warmth in it. "Nah, I don't think you're sorry enough yet." What happened next took less than 30 seconds. Red jersey shoved James hard, sending him stumbling backward. James tried to keep his balance, tried to protect Maya, but there were too many of them. Hands grabbed him, pulled him away from his sister. He heard Maya screaming, heard his own voice telling her to run, to get help. Someone punched him in the stomach. The air left his lungs in a rush. Another blow caught him on the side of the head, made his vision blur. He tried to fight back, but there were 5 of them and 1 of him, and fighting back only made them angrier. He went down hard, his knees hitting the pavement. Kicks came from multiple directions. Ribs, back, kidneys. Pain exploded in sharp bursts, overlapping, becoming a single, overwhelming sensation. Through the haze of pain and fear, James heard someone yell about a knife. He didn't know who said it, didn't know if it was a threat or a warning or just words thrown into the chaos. But he felt the change in the violence, felt it shift from a beating to something more desperate and final. The blade went into his side, just below his ribs. The sensation was strange, not painful at first, just a pressure and then a warmth spreading across his shirt. Then the pain came, sharp and overwhelming, stealing whatever breath he'd managed to get back. More shouts, running footsteps. The weight of bodies on top of him suddenly gone. James lay on the pavement, staring up at a sky that had turned from afternoon blue to early evening purple. He could hear Maya screaming his name, could hear other voices now, festival goers who'd heard the commotion, who were calling for help, who were finally paying attention now that it was too late. He tried to tell Maya he was okay, but his mouth wouldn't form the words. The warmth from his side had spread, was pooling beneath him. He felt cold despite the summer heat. Sirens in the distance, getting closer. Maya's face above him, tears streaming down her cheeks, her hands pressing against his side, trying to stop the bleeding. "Stay with me," she was saying. "James, stay with me. Help is coming." He wanted to tell her it wasn't her fault, that she shouldn't have had to see this, that their parents would be so angry at him for not protecting her better. But the words wouldn't come. The paramedics arrived 6 minutes later. They worked quickly, efficiently, loading James onto a stretcher, starting IVs, communicating in medical shorthand that Maya didn't understand. They let her ride in the ambulance, let her hold his hand while they raced to the hospital. James Chun died in the emergency room 40 minutes after being stabbed. The blade had punctured his liver, and he'd lost too much blood too quickly. The doctors worked on him for 20 minutes, but the damage was too severe. They called it at 7:47 p.m. Maya sat in a waiting room that smelled like antiseptic and despair while a victim's advocate explained what would happen next. She nodded at the right times, signed forms she didn't read, and tried to understand how an afternoon at a festival had ended with her brother dead. The investigation moved quickly. Dozens of witnesses had seen the attack. Several had filmed parts of it on their phones, shaky footage of violence unfolding in real time. The police had clear images of the 5 attackers, and within 12 hours, 4 of them were in custody. The 5th, Red Jersey, whose real name was Devin Matthews, had gone into hiding. His friends gave him up within hours of being arrested, told police his name, his address, where he was likely to run. They were all facing murder charges. Loyalty evaporated quickly when life in prison was on the table. Devin was found 3 days later at his cousin's apartment across town. He'd shaved his head and been planning to leave the state, but he hadn't moved fast enough. When officers arrested him, he claimed he'd acted in self-defense, that James had started the fight, that it had all been a misunderstanding. The video evidence told a different story. The trial was straightforward in its brutality. The prosecution presented witness testimony, video footage, forensic evidence about the knife wound. They didn't need to construct a complicated narrative. James Chun had been walking down a street with his sister when 5 men had attacked him for no reason other than perceived disrespect. One of those men had stabbed him, and he died. The defense tried to argue about gang territory, about James being in the wrong place at the wrong time, about a culture of violence that their clients had been raised in. They painted the attackers as victims of circumstance, products of systemic failure. The jury wasn't sympathetic. 4 of the 5 defendants were convicted of second-degree murder. Devin Matthews, who'd wielded the knife, was convicted of first-degree murder. The sentences ranged from 25 years to life. At the sentencing hearing, Maya Chun read a victim impact statement. She was 20 years old now, had dropped out of college after James's death because she couldn't concentrate, couldn't sleep, couldn't stop seeing his face on that pavement. She stood at the podium in the courtroom and spoke in a voice that shook but never broke. "My brother was the best person I knew," she said. "He was kind and funny, and he worked so hard for everything he had. He was going to be a lawyer. He was going to help people. And now he's gone because 5 strangers decided his life didn't matter. Because they felt disrespected by the way he looked at them. Because they needed to prove something to each other." She looked directly at Devin Matthews. "You took my brother from me. You took him from our parents. You stole his future, and you destroyed ours. And for what? What did you gain? What was worth his life?" Devin stared at the table in front of him, refused to meet her eyes. "I hope you think about James every day for the rest of your life," Maya continued. "I hope you remember what you did. Because we'll never forget. We'll never stop missing him." The judge thanked Maya for her courage in speaking. Then he sentenced Devin Matthews to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The other 4 defendants received sentences ranging from 25 to 40 years. They'd all be middle-aged men before they had any chance of freedom. Devin would never see the outside of a prison again. James's parents never attended the trial. They'd collapsed inward after his death, had stopped answering their phone, had stopped engaging with the world. Friends who tried to visit were turned away. The grief was too enormous, too consuming. They'd lost their son to random violence, to being in the wrong place at the wrong time, to a few seconds of eye contact that had been interpreted as disrespect. There was no making sense of it. James hadn't been involved in gangs, hadn't been part of any territorial dispute. He'd just been a young man enjoying a festival with his sister. But that had been enough to make him a target, because violence doesn't need justification. It just needs opportunity. The festival was canceled the following year. The organizers claimed it was due to budget concerns, but everyone knew the real reason. James's death had poisoned the event, had transformed what was supposed to be a celebration into a reminder of how quickly safety could evaporate. The alley where James died became an unofficial memorial. People left flowers, candles, photos, handwritten notes expressing sympathy and outrage. The city cleaned it up repeatedly, but the tributes kept appearing. Eventually, they installed a small plaque in memory of James Chun, 2001 to 2024. It was inadequate, but everything was inadequate. Maya eventually finished college, though it took her 3 extra years. She changed her major from business to social work. She wanted to work with victims of violence, wanted to help other families navigate the impossible aftermath of sudden loss. James's death had rewritten her entire future, had taken her on a path she never would have chosen, but now felt compelled to follow. In interviews years later, she'd talk about how random violence steals more than just a life. It steals the assumption of safety, the belief that following rules and being a good person offers any protection. My brother did everything right, she'd say. He tried to avoid conflict. He was just trying to get back to the festival. And he died anyway. The 5 men who killed James had extensive criminal records collectively. Theft, assault, drug charges, violations of probation. They'd been cycling through the criminal justice system for years, each arrest followed by minimal consequences, each release followed by more crime. The system had documented their escalating violence, but had done nothing to interrupt it, until they killed someone. Then, suddenly, the system responded with maximum force. But that response came too late for James. The case sparked debates about sentencing reform, about how to intervene with young offenders before they escalate to murder, about the cycle of violence in certain neighborhoods. Politicians gave speeches. Activists organized marches. The media covered it extensively for about 3 weeks, then moved on to the next tragedy. James's death became a statistic, a data point in discussions about urban violence. He was one of 47 people murdered in the city that year, his death grouped with others into charts and graphs that tried to identify patterns and solutions. But to his family, he wasn't a statistic. He was the son who called his mother every Sunday, the brother who taught Maya to ride a bike, the friend who always remembered birthdays, the young man who'd been excited about his future, who'd had plans and dreams and a life that was supposed to stretch out for decades. All of that ended in an alley because 5 strangers decided he'd shown them disrespect. The arbitrariness of it was suffocating. If James and Maya had walked down a different street, if they'd left the festival 5 minutes earlier or later, if James had made different eye contact or no eye contact, if any of 1,000 small variables had been different, he'd still be alive. But those variables had aligned in exactly the wrong way, and now he was dead, and 5 people were in prison, and 2 families had been destroyed, the Chins through grief, and the families of the attackers through the horror of what their children had done. There were no winners. Just loss and waste and violence that had accomplished nothing except creating more pain. Devin Matthews gave one interview from prison, 3 years into his sentence. He claimed he'd found religion, that he was a different person now, that he regretted what happened. When asked about James Chun, he said, "I think about him every day. I know what I took from his family. I know I can never make it right." The interviewer asked if he'd been aiming to kill James when he stabbed him. Devin had paused for a long time before answering. "I wasn't thinking at all," he said. "That's the truth. I was angry, and I had a knife, and everything happened so fast. I didn't think about consequences. I didn't think about him having a family or a future. I just wanted to hurt him in the moment." That honesty was somehow more disturbing than any excuse would have been. Devin hadn't been a calculated killer. He'd been an angry young man with a weapon who'd made a split-second decision that had ended a life and destroyed his own. The waste of it was staggering. James Chin should have gone to law school. He should have had a career, a family, a life full of the ordinary pleasures and pains that make up a human existence. Instead, he had a memorial plaque and a grave his parents visited every week. Maya Chin should have had her brother at her wedding, should have had him meet her future children, should have had decades of sibling friendship ahead of her. Instead, she had trauma and grief and a hole in her life that would never be filled. The 5 men who attacked James should have had the opportunity to grow up, to mature, to become people who contributed something positive to the world. Instead, they had prison cells and the knowledge that they'd thrown away their lives for nothing. Everyone lost. Violence consumed everything it touched and left nothing but wreckage. The festival never came back. The city tried to organize other events, tried to reclaim that sense of community celebration, but they never felt the same. James's death had exposed the illusion that public spaces are inherently safe, that being surrounded by people offers protection. Sometimes violence finds you anyway. Sometimes being uninvolved doesn't keep you safe. Sometimes you're just in the wrong place at the wrong time, and that's enough. James Chin's story didn't have a lesson that made sense. It didn't offer any comfort or wisdom. It was just senseless violence that destroyed multiple lives and accomplished nothing except adding to the world's store of grief. His death proved that being good, being innocent, being careful, none of it guaranteed safety. That random chance could kill you just as easily as deliberate malice. But the danger didn't always come from people you knew or trusted. Sometimes it came from strangers on a street who decided your existence was an insult to them. And there was no way to protect yourself from that. No strategy, no precaution, no amount of awareness that could eliminate the risk. You could only hope that your path never crossed with people who decided violence was an acceptable response to feeling disrespected. And if it did, you could only hope you'd be lucky enough to survive it. James hadn't been lucky. The street where he died was repaved the following spring as part of routine maintenance. The fresh asphalt covered the bloodstains that had been scrubbed away but never quite disappeared. Cars drove over that spot every day, their drivers unaware they were crossing the exact location where a young man had bled out while his sister screamed for help. Life went on. It always does. The city continued functioning. People went to work, raised families, pursued their dreams. The absence of James Chun didn't stop the world from turning. But for the people who loved him, the world had fundamentally changed. It had revealed itself to be more fragile and more dangerous than they'd understood. Safety was an illusion. Control was a myth. Sometimes violence found you for no reason at all, and there was nothing you could do to prevent it. That knowledge was its own kind of violence, a wound that would never fully heal. Maya Chin still walked past that alley sometimes. She'd stop, stand there for a moment, remember her brother's face on the pavement, and feel the weight of everything that had been stolen from both of them. Then she'd keep walking, because that's all anyone can do. Keep walking, keep living, keep trying to make sense of a world that often makes no sense at all. James was gone. The men who killed him were in prison. The city had moved on. But the violence remained, embedded in memory, in trauma, in the way Maya flinched at sudden movements and avoided crowds. It remained in the empty chair at family dinners, in the phone calls that would never come, in the future that had been erased in 30 seconds of senseless brutality. Trust hadn't been the weapon this time. Random chance had been the weapon. Wrong place, wrong time, wrong look exchanged with the wrong people. Sometimes that's all it takes. Sometimes being alive is just being lucky enough not to have crossed paths with someone else's violence yet. James's luck had run out on a summer afternoon in a crowded street during a festival. And now he was gone, and nothing could bring him back, and his sister would spend the rest of her life remembering the sound of his blood hitting the pavement while strangers filmed it on their phones. The Richardson house sat on 2 acres of carefully maintained property at the edge of town. White clapboard siding, a wide front porch with rocking chairs, gardens that bloomed precisely on schedule. Every Sunday morning, the family's car would pull out of the driveway at 8:15, heading to Grace Community Church where Michael Richardson served as a deacon and his wife, Sharon, led the women's Bible study group. From the outside, they were exactly what they appeared to be, a devout family living according to their faith, respected in their community, admired for their commitment to Christian values. From the inside, the house was a prison. Rebecca Richardson was 34 years old when she disappeared. For 16 years, she'd been married to Michael, had borne him 3 children, had maintained his household according to his exacting standards. She'd smiled at church functions, had hosted prayer meetings in her living room, had presented the image of a joyful, submissive wife who'd found her purpose in serving her husband and God. No one knew she was slowly being erased. The process had been gradual, so incremental that Rebecca herself hadn't noticed it was happening until it was too late. It had started with small things. Michael suggesting that maybe she didn't need to work outside the home, that their children would benefit from having a full-time mother. That had made sense, felt like mutual decision. Then came the suggestion that maybe she should limit her time with certain friends, women he felt were too worldly, who might influence her away from proper values. That had felt like spiritual guidance, like her husband caring about her soul. Then the monitoring of her phone calls, presented as concern for her emotional well-being. The insistence that she ask permission before making purchases, framed as financial responsibility. The requirement that she document her daily activities, explained as helping her be more efficient with her time. Each restriction had come wrapped in scripture, in concern, in the language of love and protection. And Rebecca, who'd been raised in the same faith tradition, who'd been taught that wifely submission was godly, had accepted it, had internalized it, had convinced herself that Michael's control was actually caring, that her growing isolation was actually intimacy. By the time she understood what was happening, she was trapped. Sharon Richardson was Michael's mother. She lived in a cottage on the property, close enough to be involved in every aspect of the household, but separate enough to maintain the illusion of independence. She was 72 years old, a widow who devoted her life to raising her son in righteousness, and who saw Rebecca as a disappointing vessel for his affection. Sharon had never approved of Rebecca. She'd been too young when they married, too pretty, too likely to distract Michael from his spiritual calling. Over the years, Sharon had made it her mission to shape Rebecca into a more suitable wife, to correct her deficiencies, to ensure she understood her proper role. That meant enforcing Michael's rules, reporting Rebecca's infractions, making sure the children understood that their mother's failures were opportunities for discipline and growth. The Richardson children were homeschooled, isolated from outside influences that might corrupt them. 14-year-old Sarah was being trained in domestic arts, preparing for her own future as a godly wife. 12-year-old Nathan was being groomed to follow his father's example of righteous leadership. 9-year-old Grace was too young to understand that their family wasn't normal, that other children didn't watch their mothers flinch when their fathers came home. Rebecca had tried to leave once, 3 years before her disappearance. She'd packed a bag, had taken the children to her sister's house 2 states away. But Michael had found them within 48 hours. He'd arrived with their pastor, with carefully prepared arguments about the sanctity of marriage and Rebecca's duty to her family. He'd cried, had promised to be better, had convinced her that running away was the sin, not his treatment of her. The pastor had agreed. He'd counseled Rebecca about the importance of forgiveness, about how her commitment to her marriage was a testimony to her faith. He'd suggested that perhaps if Rebecca was more joyful in her submission, if she focused less on her own desires and more on serving her family, the marriage would improve. Rebecca had gone back. What choice did she have? Her entire community believed that her husband's authority was ordained by God. Leaving him meant abandoning her faith, her children, everything that gave her life meaning. So she'd returned, and Michael had made sure she'd never try to leave again. The monitoring intensified. Michael installed cameras throughout the house, told Rebecca they were for security, but she knew they were for watching her. He took her car keys, said she didn't need to drive when she had nowhere to go. He confiscated her phone, gave her a basic model that only called his number and Sharon's. Rebecca stopped existing as an individual person. She became a function, a role, a set of duties performed under constant surveillance. The abuse was never physical. Michael never hit her, never left marks that anyone could see. The abuse was in the erosion of her autonomy, in the systematic dismantling of her selfhood, in the daily reinforcement that she was nothing without him, that her thoughts were irrelevant, that her feelings were sinful attempts to elevate herself above her husband's authority. Sharon participated fully. She criticized Rebecca's cooking, her housekeeping, her parenting. She sat in their living room and listed Rebecca's failures while Michael nodded, adding his own observations, framing every complaint as loving correction. She taught the children to view their mother with contempt, to report her infractions, to see her weakness as something to be ashamed of. The children learned their lessons well. Sarah began refusing to obey Rebecca, saying she only took orders from her father. Nathan started speaking to his mother with the same tone of disappointed authority that Michael used. Even little Grace learned to look at her mother with pity and judgment. Rebecca was trapped in a house with people who believed they were saving her soul by destroying her spirit. The church community saw none of this. They saw Michael's tireless work as a deacon, his commitment to biblical teaching, his devotion to his family. They saw Sharon's wisdom and her dedication to raising godly grandchildren. They saw Rebecca's quiet demeanor and interpreted it as contentment, as the peace that comes from surrendering to God's design for marriage. When Rebecca stopped attending church functions, When she became increasingly withdrawn, people assumed she was struggling with depression or perhaps spiritual attack. The women's Bible study group prayed for her. The pastor visited occasionally, offering counsel that always centered on Rebecca's need to be more trusting, more forgiving, more willing to see her circumstances as opportunities for spiritual growth. No one asked if she was safe. No one questioned why she seemed to be disappearing. Rebecca's sister, Jennifer, was the only person who understood something was desperately wrong. She called every week, tried to maintain contact, but Michael usually answered the phone. He'd say Rebecca was busy, or tired, or not feeling well. When Jennifer did manage to speak to Rebecca, the conversations were stilted, clearly monitored, full of Rebecca saying she was fine, everything was fine, don't worry. Jennifer worried anyway. She contacted local authorities, tried to report that her sister was being held against her will. But what law was being broken? Rebecca was an adult who'd chosen to stay in her marriage. She wasn't being held at gunpoint. She could leave anytime she wanted. Except she couldn't. Not really. Not when leaving meant losing her children, her community, her eternal salvation. Not when everyone around her insisted that her suffering was actually sanctification. Rebecca disappeared on a Wednesday in March. Michael reported her missing that evening, told police she'd been acting strangely for weeks, talking about going away, not making sense. He said he'd come home from work to find her gone. No note, no explanation. Sharon supported his story. Rebecca had been unstable, she told investigators. Rebellious, unwilling to accept help. They'd been trying to get her into counseling, but she'd refused. The children were more troubling. When interviewed separately, they repeated versions of the same story. Their mother had been unhappy, had been talking about leaving, had been selfish and difficult. The answers sounded rehearsed, coached, but children often sounded that way when they were upset. Jennifer drove in from 2 states away the moment she heard Rebecca was missing. She told police about the control, the isolation, the systematic abuse. She described the one time Rebecca had escaped and how Michael had brought her back. She begged them to investigate Michael, to look at his property, to treat this as something other than a voluntary disappearance. The police did investigate. They searched the Richardson property, used cadaver dogs, interviewed neighbors. They found nothing. No body, no evidence of violence. No proof that Rebecca hadn't simply left of her own accord. Michael cooperated fully with the investigation. He provided access to his property, answered questions calmly, maintained the image of a concerned husband desperate to find his wife. He suggested that Rebecca might have had a mental breakdown, that she might not be thinking clearly, that she needed help. The church community rallied around him. They organized search parties, distributed flyers, prayed publicly for Rebecca's safe return. They saw Michael's grief as genuine, saw Sharon's worry as the natural concern of a mother-in-law who'd cared for Rebecca like her own daughter. They saw what they wanted to see, what fit their narrative of the world. But Jennifer kept pushing. She hired a private investigator, offered a reward for information, refused to accept that Rebecca had simply vanished. The investigator found some disturbing details: credit cards in Rebecca's name that had been opened without her knowledge, bank accounts she'd never accessed, a will that had been revised 2 months before her disappearance, leaving everything to Michael. Still, none of it was proof of murder. It was proof of financial control, of manipulation, but not of violence. 6 months after Rebecca disappeared, a hiker found remains in a wooded area about 40 miles from the Richardson property. The body had been there for months, partially decomposed, partially consumed by animals. But dental records confirmed what Jennifer had known from the moment Rebecca went missing. This was Rebecca Richardson. The autopsy revealed she died from manual strangulation. The hyoid bone in her neck was fractured, indicating sustained pressure to her throat. She'd been dead before she was dumped in those woods, dead before Michael had reported her missing. The investigation shifted from missing person to homicide. Detectives re-interviewed everyone, this time looking for evidence of murder rather than voluntary disappearance. They analyzed Michael's timeline, checked his phone records, examined his car for trace evidence. What they found was a man who'd been extraordinarily careful. Michael had alibis for his whereabouts, had witnesses who'd seen him at work the day Rebecca supposedly disappeared. His car was clean, professionally detailed just days after Rebecca went missing. His phone records showed normal usage, nothing suspicious. But the private investigator Jennifer had hired found something the police had missed. Security footage from a gas station 30 miles from the Richardson property showed Michael's car at 3 in the morning on the night Rebecca likely died. He'd claimed to be home sleeping. That footage, combined with the location of Rebecca's body, created a timeline that contradicted Michael's statements. He'd been in the area where her body was found, during the window when she was likely killed. It wasn't conclusive proof, but it was enough for an arrest. Michael maintained his innocence. His attorney argued that the security footage showed his car, not necessarily him driving it. That Rebecca could have been killed by anyone, dumped by anyone. That Michael was a grieving husband being railroaded by overzealous investigators. The trial revealed the full extent of the abuse Rebecca had endured. Jennifer testified about the control, the isolation, the systematic erasure of her sister's autonomy. She brought letters Rebecca had written but never sent, documenting the daily humiliations and restrictions she'd lived under. She presented a picture of a woman who'd been trapped, not a woman who'd left voluntarily. Former church members came forward, people who'd left Grace Community because they'd become uncomfortable with the teachings about male authority and female submission. They described a culture where abuse was reframed as discipline, where women who expressed unhappiness were told they had spiritual problems, where questioning authority was treated as rebellion against God. Sarah Richardson, now 15, was called to testify. She'd been living with Jennifer since her father's arrest, had been in therapy processing 16 years of indoctrination. On the stand, she broke down and admitted that her father had coached all 3 children on what to say if anyone asked about their mother. He told us that Mom was weak, that she couldn't handle being a wife and mother, that we needed to protect him by showing that she was the problem. Sarah was crying, her voice barely audible. He said if we didn't back him up, we'd all be separated, that the state would take us away, that we'd never see each other again. The defense tried to discredit her testimony, suggesting she'd been influenced by Jennifer, that she was a troubled teenager turning against her father. But Sarah's pain was too genuine, her memories too specific. Nathan, 13 now, testified next. He described watching his father and grandmother systematically break his mother's spirit. They made her ask permission for everything, he said. She couldn't even go to the bathroom without Dad knowing where she was. Grandma would time her, would report if she took too long. They said it was about teaching her discipline, about helping her overcome her selfish nature. He described the night his mother disappeared, how his father had come home late, had been agitated, had told the children that their mother had left them because she was sick and selfish, how they'd practiced what to say to police, how his father had promised they'd be a stronger family without her weakness dragging them down. Sharon Richardson was charged as an accessory after the fact. She'd helped Michael conceal the crime, had supported his lies, had participated in coaching the children. But she maintained to the end that Michael was innocent, that Rebecca had brought her fate upon herself through rebellion and pride. The most damning evidence came from Grace herself, the youngest child. At 9, when her mother disappeared, now 10, she testified with a child's unfiltered honesty. She described hearing her parents arguing the night Rebecca died, hearing her mother crying and begging, hearing sounds she didn't understand at the time, but that investigators interpreted as sounds of violence. "I wanted to help Mommy," Grace said. "But Grandma came and got me, took me to her cottage. She said Mommy was being corrected, that I shouldn't interfere, that Daddy knew what was best." Michael's defense crumbled under the weight of his children's testimony. His attorney tried to argue that they'd been manipulated, that Jennifer had poisoned them against their father. But the jury saw 3 children who were processing trauma, not 3 children who were lying. The prosecution presented a theory of the crime based on all the evidence. Rebecca had confronted Michael about wanting a divorce. She'd found copies of legal documents he'd prepared to ensure she'd get nothing if they separated, that he'd maintain custody of the children. She'd threatened to expose the abuse to authorities, to fight for her freedom regardless of the cost. Michael couldn't allow that. His reputation, his standing in the church, his authority in his home, all of it depended on maintaining the image of the godly family. A divorce would shatter that image, would raise questions about his fitness as a deacon, would undermine everything he'd built. So he'd strangled her, had killed her in their home while his children slept and his mother kept watch, had wrapped her body in a tarp and driven 40 miles to dump her in the woods like garbage. had come home and cleaned up, had prepared his story, had coached his children, had reported her missing with practiced grief. The jury deliberated for 4 days. When they returned, they found Michael Richardson guilty of first-degree murder. Sharon Richardson was convicted of being an accessory and received a 5-year sentence. She was 73 by then, would likely die in prison. She showed no remorse, insisted until the end that they were being persecuted for their faith. At his sentencing hearing, Michael finally spoke. He didn't confess, didn't apologize. Instead, he claimed he was a victim of a society that had rejected biblical values, that punished men for trying to lead their families according to God's design. He said Rebecca's death was a tragedy, but that his prosecution was a greater tragedy, an attack on religious freedom. The judge wasn't sympathetic. He sentenced Michael Richardson to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Jennifer was awarded custody of all 3 children. The transition was difficult. They'd been so thoroughly indoctrinated that deprogramming took years. Sarah struggled with guilt, with feeling responsible for not protecting her mother. Nathan had anger issues, would rage about his father's imprisonment, then collapse crying about what his father had done to his mother. Grace had nightmares, would wake up screaming for a mother who would never come. But they were safe now. They were in therapy, were learning what healthy relationships looked like, were slowly understanding that what they'd witnessed wasn't normal, wasn't godly, wasn't love. Grace Community Church struggled to process what had happened. Some members left immediately, horrified by what they'd unknowingly enabled. Others doubled down, insisted that Michael's conviction was persecution, that he was being martyred for his faith. The church eventually split, with the more moderate faction forming a new congregation while the extremists maintained the original church under new leadership. Rebecca's grave was in a cemetery near Jennifer's home, far from the Richardson property, far from the church where she'd been taught that her suffering was sanctification. Jennifer visited every week, brought flowers, talked to her sister about the children, about how they were healing, about how Rebecca's death hadn't been in vain because it had freed them. But it had been in vain. Rebecca shouldn't have had to die to free her children. She should have been able to leave, should have had support from her community, should have been believed when she tried to get help. Instead, she'd been trapped by people who used God as a weapon, who twisted scripture to justify control, who convinced her that her suffering was holy. And when she'd finally tried to break free, her husband had killed her rather than lose his authority. The most chilling aspect of the case was how many people had seen what was happening and done nothing. Neighbors who'd noticed Rebecca's increasing isolation. Church members who'd observed the family dynamic and felt uncomfortable but never intervened. The pastor who'd counseled Rebecca to submit more completely instead of questioning whether her husband's behavior was abusive. They'd all been complicit. Not legally, perhaps, but morally. They'd seen a woman being erased and had convinced themselves it was her spiritual journey, her trial, her opportunity for growth. They'd been wrong, and Rebecca had paid for their willingness to look away. The case became a flashpoint in discussions about religious extremism, about how spiritual authority can enable abuse, about the dangers of complementarian theology taken to its logical extreme. Some churches reformed their teaching on marriage, started providing resources for women in abusive relationships, began training leaders to recognize signs of domestic violence. Other churches rejected those changes, insisted that the Richardson case was an aberration, that most men who embraced biblical leadership didn't murder their wives. They weren't wrong about that. Most didn't. But the theology that had enabled Michael's abuse was still being taught, was still trapping women in situations where leaving meant losing everything, where suffering was reframed as sanctification. Rebecca Richardson had been one victim. How many others were still trapped? Sarah Richardson spoke at a domestic violence awareness event when she was 18. She'd graduated high school, was planning to study social work, wanted to help other young people escape abusive environments. She talked about her mother with love and grief and anger. "My mom was smart and kind and strong," Sarah said. "But she was taught that her strength was pride, that her intelligence was dangerous, that her kindness needed to be channeled through obedience to my father. They took a beautiful person and tried to make her into nothing. And when she wouldn't cooperate, when she finally tried to leave, they killed her." She paused, looked out at the audience. "My father didn't kill my mom because he was religious. He killed her because he couldn't accept that she was a person with her own thoughts and desires and rights. The religion just gave him the language to justify what he wanted to do anyway, control her completely. That distinction mattered. This wasn't about faith. It was about power, about a man who'd used God as a shield while he systematically destroyed his wife's autonomy. Religion had been the tool, not the cause. But it had been an effective tool. It had provided Michael with a community that supported his authority, a framework that justified his control, and a vocabulary that made abuse sound like love. Rebecca had been trapped not just by one man, but by an entire system of belief that told her suffering was holy, that her husband's authority was absolute, that leaving was sin. She tried to escape anyway, and it had cost her everything. The Richardson house was sold after Sharon's conviction. The new owners razed it, built something completely different on the land. But people in town still called it the Richardson property, still drove past with a mixture of horror and fascination. The children never went back. They'd built new lives far from that place, were creating new identities separate from the nightmare they'd survived. They talked to each other every week, supported each other through the ongoing process of healing. But they'd never fully recover. How could they? They'd watched their father murder their mother, had been forced to participate in covering it up, had lived for months not knowing she was dead while pretending she'd abandoned them. That kind of trauma doesn't heal. It just becomes part of who you are. Rebecca Richardson trusted the wrong people. She trusted her husband to honor his vows. She trusted her church to protect her. She trusted her faith community to recognize abuse when they saw it. They'd all failed her, and she died because of it, strangled in her own home by the man who'd promised to love and cherish her, with her children sleeping nearby and her mother-in-law standing guard. The danger had been in her own house, wearing the mask of godly authority, hiding behind scripture while slowly erasing her existence. Until the day she tried to take it back. Then the mask came off, and the danger became fatal. Melissa Torres was 19 when she met Brandon Hayes at a college party. He was 21, charismatic, attentive in a way that felt intoxicating. He asked questions about her life, her dreams, her thoughts on everything from politics to music. He made her feel seen, understood, special. The first 6 months were perfect. Brandon was everything Melissa had imagined a boyfriend should be. Romantic, thoughtful, constantly telling her how lucky he was to have found her. He'd show up at her dorm with flowers, would text her good morning every day, would plan elaborate dates that made her friends jealous. Melissa's roommate, Kayla, was less impressed. She thought Brandon was too intense, too possessive of Melissa's time and attention. She'd noticed how he'd show up uninvited at the library when Melissa was studying, how he'd get upset if she didn't respond to his texts immediately, how he'd subtly criticize her friends and family. "He's isolating you," Kayla said one night after Brandon had convinced Melissa to skip a friend's birthday party to spend time with him instead. "He's not isolating me," Melissa had argued. "He just wants to spend time together. That's not a crime." But Kayla had been right. The isolation was happening slowly, incrementally, in ways that Melissa didn't recognize as problematic because they were always framed as love. Brandon didn't order her not to see her friends. He just got sad when she chose them over him. Just made her feel guilty for wanting time apart. Just reminded her how much he missed her when she wasn't there. By their 1-year anniversary, Melissa had stopped seeing most of her friends. She'd transferred to a different dorm because Brandon said her roommate was toxic and jealous. She'd stopped going to club meetings and social events because Brandon needed her, because spending time with him felt more important than maintaining other relationships. Kayla tried to stay in touch, but Melissa's responses became more sporadic, more defensive. She insisted she was happy, that Brandon was wonderful, that everyone was just jealous of what they had together. Then the monitoring started. Brandon wanted access to Melissa's phone, not because he didn't trust her, he explained, but because couples shouldn't have secrets from each other. True intimacy meant total transparency. He gave her access to his phone too, made it seem reciprocal, made it seem reasonable. Except Brandon had nothing to hide because he'd arranged his life so that Melissa was his entire world. Melissa had friends she was supposed to stop talking to, family members Brandon considered bad influences, a whole life that Brandon was systematically editing. He checked her location constantly. If she said she was going to the library and her phone showed her at a coffee shop, he'd call demanding an explanation. If she took too long running an errand, he'd show up looking for her, would say he was worried, would make his surveillance seem like caring. Melissa started to feel suffocated but didn't know how to articulate it. Wasn't this what relationships were supposed to be? Wasn't it good that Brandon cared so much about her? Wasn't she lucky to have someone who loved her this intensely? Her parents noticed the change when she came home for winter break. She was quieter, more withdrawn. She checked her phone constantly, seemed anxious when Brandon called, which he did every hour. When they tried to talk to her about it, Melissa got defensive. "You don't understand him," she said. "He's been hurt before. He just needs reassurance." But her father, a retired police officer, recognized the signs of an abusive relationship. He'd seen it dozens of times. The isolation, the monitoring, the way Melissa seemed to be walking on eggshells around Brandon's moods. "This isn't healthy, Melissa," he said. "This is control dressed up as love." Melissa had left the room crying, had called Brandon sobbing that her parents didn't understand, that they were trying to turn her against him. Brandon had comforted her, had reinforced that her family was toxic, that she needed to limit contact with them for her own well-being. By the time she returned to college, Melissa had started to believe it. Her family didn't understand. Her friends were jealous. Only Brandon really knew her, really loved her, really wanted what was best for her. The first time Brandon hit her was on a Tuesday night in March. They were in his apartment arguing about Melissa wanting to take a summer internship in another state. Brandon didn't want her to go, said long distance wouldn't work, said she was choosing her career over their relationship. Melissa had tried to explain that it was just 3 months, that it was important for her future, that they'd survive being apart. Brandon had gotten increasingly agitated, had accused her of wanting to leave him, of planning to cheat on him while she was away. "You don't actually love me," he'd said. "If you loved me, you wouldn't even consider leaving. That's not fair. This is about my education, my career." The slap came out of nowhere, sharp and stunning. Melissa had stood there in shock, her hand going to her cheek, not quite believing what had just happened. Brandon had immediately crumpled, had fallen to his knees apologizing, crying, saying he didn't know what came over him, that he'd never done anything like that before, that he was so sorry, that it would never happen again. And Melissa, because she loved him, because she'd invested 2 years in this relationship, because leaving felt impossible, had forgiven him. That was her mistake. The first physical violence is never the last. Brandon's abuse followed a predictable cycle. He'd be wonderful for weeks, attentive and loving and everything she'd fallen for. Then something would trigger his jealousy or his need for control. He'd escalate to verbal abuse, then physical violence. Then came the apologies, the promises, the temporary reformation. Each time, the violence got worse. The slap became a punch. The punch became a beating. The beatings became more frequent, more severe, harder to hide. Melissa started wearing long sleeves even in summer. She became an expert at makeup techniques for covering bruises. She lied to everyone about how she'd gotten injured. She'd fallen. She'd walked into a door. She was just clumsy. Her professors noticed her grades slipping. Her remaining friends saw less and less of her. Her family's phone calls went increasingly unanswered. Melissa was disappearing into the relationship, was becoming a ghost of her former self. Kayla, her former roommate, tried one more time to reach her. She'd seen Melissa on campus with a black eye poorly concealed by sunglasses and foundation. She'd cornered her in the bathroom, had begged her to get help. "He's going to kill you," Kayla had said bluntly. "Maybe not today, maybe not next month, but this kind of violence always escalates. You need to leave before it's too late." Melissa had denied everything. The black eye was from falling, she'd insisted. Brandon would never seriously hurt her. Kayla was being dramatic. But that night, alone in Brandon's apartment while he was at work, Melissa had looked at herself in the mirror and barely recognized the person staring back. When had she become so small? When had she started believing she deserved this? She'd started researching domestic violence, had found descriptions of her relationship on every website about abuse. The isolation, the jealousy, the monitoring, the cycle of violence and apology, it was all textbook. She wasn't crazy. She wasn't overreacting. She was being abused. Melissa started planning her escape. She did it carefully, knowing that leaving was the most dangerous time. She contacted a domestic violence shelter, learned about restraining orders, started slowly moving important documents and belongings to a friend's house when Brandon was at work. She was going to leave him. She was going to get out. But Brandon's parents got involved before she could execute her plan. Thomas and Patricia Hayes were wealthy, influential people who'd always protected their son from consequences. When Brandon had been arrested for assault in high school, they'd paid for lawyers who got the charges dropped. When he'd been expelled from his first college for stalking a girlfriend, they'd made donations that got him accepted elsewhere. They knew Brandon was troubled. They just didn't care as long as his problems didn't reflect badly on them. When Brandon told them Melissa was planning to leave, that she'd been talking about getting a restraining order, that she might go to police about the abuse, his parents went into damage control mode. They couldn't have their son facing legal consequences. They couldn't have the Hayes name associated with domestic violence. Thomas Hayes made phone calls. He contacted the college administration, threatened to withdraw major donations if they took any action against Brandon. He hired a PR firm to prepare for potential negative publicity. He made it clear that protecting Brandon was the priority, regardless of what that meant for Melissa. Patricia Hayes took a different approach. She called Melissa's parents, presented herself as a concerned future mother-in-law worried about the young couple's relationship problems. She suggested that Melissa was unstable, that she'd been making accusations against Brandon because of mental health issues, that the family was trying to get her help. Melissa's parents didn't believe it, but the Hayes family's influence was considerable. They owned property throughout the state, had connections to judges and politicians, had the kind of wealth that made problems disappear. Melissa tried to get a restraining order anyway. She went to the courthouse with photographs of her injuries, with text messages where Brandon had threatened her, with documentation of his escalating violence. The judge who heard her petition was a family friend of the Hayes. He denied the restraining order, said there wasn't sufficient evidence of imminent danger, suggested that young couples often had difficulties that could be resolved through counseling. That denial was a death sentence. Brandon knew now that Melissa had tried to leave, had tried to get legal protection. His violence had always been about control, but now it was also about punishment. She'd betrayed him by trying to escape. She needed to understand that leaving wasn't an option. The final assault happened on a Friday night in May. They were in Brandon's apartment. Melissa had been trying to be compliant, trying to keep him calm while she figured out another escape plan. But Brandon had been drinking, had been obsessing about Melissa's attempted restraining order, had worked himself into a rage about her disloyalty. "You tried to destroy me," he said. "You tried to ruin my life with your lies. Brandon, please." The beating was savage. Brandon lost all control, all pretense of loving her. He punched her, kicked her, slammed her head against the wall repeatedly. Melissa tried to fight back, tried to protect herself, but he was bigger and stronger and consumed by rage. Neighbors heard the screaming, heard furniture breaking, heard Melissa begging Brandon to stop. One of them called 911. Police arrived to find Melissa unconscious on the floor, blood pooling around her head. Brandon was sitting calmly on the couch, his knuckles split and bleeding. "She attacked me," he told the officers. "I was defending myself." Melissa was rushed to the hospital with a fractured skull, broken ribs, internal bleeding. She spent 3 days in intensive care, her parents at her bedside, the machines keeping her alive beeping steadily while doctors worked to reduce the swelling in her brain. She survived. Barely. Brandon was arrested and charged with attempted murder. His parents immediately hired the best defense attorneys money could buy. The attorneys began building a case that portrayed Melissa as the aggressor, Brandon as the victim defending himself from an unstable girlfriend. They painted Melissa as mentally ill, claimed she'd attacked Brandon first, presented the restraining order she'd tried to get as evidence of her vindictive nature. They brought in expert witnesses who testified about how women sometimes fabricate abuse claims, how photographs of injuries could be staged, how text messages could be taken out of context. The trial was brutal. Melissa had to testify about every instance of abuse, had to describe in detail how Brandon had systematically isolated and controlled her, had to relive the final assault while Brandon's attorneys tried to discredit her at every turn. Brandon's parents sat in the courtroom every day, showing support for their son, never once making eye contact with Melissa or her family. They'd hired a PR team that was spinning the narrative in the media, suggesting that Brandon was being railroaded by a vengeful ex-girlfriend, that this was a case of he said you said being blown out of proportion. But the evidence was overwhelming. Melissa's injuries were documented extensively. Multiple witnesses had heard the assault. The 911 call captured Melissa's screams. Medical experts testified that her injuries were consistent with sustained, brutal violence, not with self-defense. The jury convicted Brandon Hayes of aggravated assault, not attempted murder. The defense had successfully argued that he hadn't specifically intended to kill her, just to hurt her. The distinction would matter at sentencing. Brandon showed no remorse during the trial. When given the opportunity to speak before sentencing, he maintained that he'd been defending himself, that Melissa had ruined his life with her lies, that he was the real victim. The judge wasn't sympathetic. He sentenced Brandon to 15 years in prison. His parents were outraged. They filed appeals, continued to insist their son was innocent, started a website claiming he'd been wrongly convicted. They never once acknowledged what Brandon had done to Melissa, never expressed concern for her recovery, never took any responsibility for raising a son who believed violence was an acceptable response to losing control. Melissa spent months in physical therapy relearning how to walk properly, how to manage the chronic pain from her injuries, how to deal with the cognitive effects of her traumatic brain injury. She had to drop out of college, had to move back in with her parents, had to rebuild her life from the ground up. The psychological recovery was even harder. She had nightmares about Brandon, would panic at the sound of footsteps behind her, couldn't be in a room with someone without knowing where all the exits were. She was diagnosed with PTSD, started intensive therapy, joined a support group for domestic violence survivors. Slowly, painfully, she began to heal. 3 years after the assault, Melissa enrolled in online classes to finish her degree. She became an advocate for domestic violence victims, speaking at schools and community centers about the warning signs of abuse, about how relationships that seem intense and romantic can become dangerous, about the importance of believing victims when they ask for help. I was lucky, she'd tell audiences. I survived, but I almost didn't. And the system that was supposed to protect me, the college that should have taken the abuse seriously, the judge who denied my restraining order, the people who believed Brandon's parents instead of my injuries, that system nearly killed me. She was particularly passionate about challenging the narrative that abuse victims can just leave. People don't understand how trapped you become, she'd explain. It's not just physical. It's psychological, emotional, financial. Brandon had convinced me I was worthless without him, that no one else would ever love me, that I was the problem. Even when I knew I needed to leave, even when I was planning my escape, part of me still believed his version of reality. Brandon came up for parole after serving 7 years of his sentence. Melissa attended the hearing, gave a victim impact statement describing how his violence had permanently altered her life. The parole board denied his release, citing his continued lack of remorse and his parents' ongoing attempts to portray him as the victim. He'd served the full 15 years. By then, Melissa would be in her 30s, would have built a life beyond what Brandon had tried to destroy. The Hayes family never accepted responsibility for enabling Brandon's behavior. They continued to maintain his innocence, continued to blame Melissa, continued to believe that their money and influence should have protected their son from consequences. But they were wrong. For once, privilege hadn't been enough. The evidence had been too clear, the injuries too severe, the pattern of abuse too well documented. Brandon Hayes was in prison, and Melissa Torres was free. Not free from the trauma. That would stay with her forever. Not free from the physical effects of the beating. She'd have chronic pain and cognitive issues for the rest of her life. But free from Brandon. Free from the relationship that had nearly killed her. Free to rebuild an identity that wasn't defined by his violence. The case became a teaching example in domestic violence prevention programs. The warning signs had all been there from the beginning. The intensity, the jealousy, the isolation, the monitoring. Melissa had even recognized them near the end, had tried to leave, had sought help from the legal system. But she'd been failed by institutions that should have protected her. The college that prioritized donations over student safety. The judge who was friends with Brandon's family. The people who'd believed that a wealthy young man from a good family couldn't possibly be an abuser. They'd been wrong, and Melissa had nearly died because of it. The most heartbreaking aspect of the case was how preventable it had been. If the college had taken the first reports of Brandon's controlling behavior seriously, if the judge had granted the restraining order, if Brandon's parents had gotten him help instead of covering up his violence, Melissa might never have been hospitalized, might never have spent months relearning how to walk, might never have had to rebuild her entire life. But none of those interventions had happened. Everyone had looked the other way, had made excuses, had prioritized Brandon's future over Melissa's safety, until she'd almost died. And then suddenly everyone wanted to talk about warning signs and missed opportunities and how tragic it all was. Melissa refused to let her story be just a tragedy. She turned her survival into advocacy, used her experience to educate others, fought to change the systems that had failed her. She lobbied for stronger domestic violence protections, for mandatory training for judges who hear restraining order petitions, for college policies that took relationship abuse seriously. She spoke to police departments about the importance of documenting injuries and taking victim statements seriously even when the abuser comes from a powerful family. She couldn't change what had happened to her, but she could try to prevent it from happening to someone else. Brandon's violence had been predictable, had followed the pattern that domestic violence experts had been documenting for decades. The romance that felt too intense too fast. The jealousy disguised as caring. The isolation from friends and family. The monitoring and control. The escalation to physical violence. The cycle of abuse and apology. None of it was unique. None of it was special. It was textbook intimate partner violence, the kind that sends women to hospitals and morgues every day. Melissa had survived, but hundreds of others didn't. Every year, intimate partners killed over 2,000 people in the United States. Most of the victims were women. Most of the killers were men. Most of the murders were preventable. The warning signs were always there. The question was whether anyone was paying attention. In Melissa's case, people had been paying attention. They just hadn't cared enough to intervene effectively. Kayla had warned her. Her parents had recognized the abuse. The judge had seen her injuries and denied protection anyway. The system had known she was in danger and had decided that protecting Brandon was more important than protecting her. That was the real horror. Not that abuse happened. That was terrible, but unfortunately common. The real horror was that when victims asked for help, when they showed their bruises and documented their fear and begged for protection, the system so often failed them. Melissa had been lucky that the system had failed her in a way that only left her hospitalized instead of dead. That the beating Brandon had given her had been severe enough to overcome his family's influence, had been documented thoroughly enough to secure a conviction. But she shouldn't have had to almost die to be believed. She shouldn't have had to survive attempted murder to get justice. The trust Melissa had placed in Brandon had nearly killed her. But the trust she'd placed in the legal system to protect her had been almost as dangerous. That trust had convinced her that getting a restraining order would keep her safe, that asking for help was a viable option, that the authorities would intervene before it was too late. None of that had been true. The restraining order had been denied. The help hadn't come. The intervention had happened only after she'd already been beaten nearly to death. Trust, once again, had been the weapon. Not just Brandon's betrayal of her love, but the system's betrayal of her faith that protection was possible. She'd learned that lesson in blood and broken bones and months of recovery. Had learned that sometimes the people and institutions you trust to keep you safe are the most dangerous of all, because they convince you that help is possible when really, you're on your own. Melissa survived anyway, built a life anyway, turned her trauma into purpose anyway. But she'd never trust that easily again. How could she, when trust had nearly cost her everything? Brandon Hayes would be released eventually, would walk free, while Melissa still dealt with the physical and psychological scars he'd given her. His parents would probably welcome him home, would continue to insist he'd been wrongly convicted, would help him rebuild his life. And somewhere, another young woman would meet him at a party, would be charmed by his attention and his intensity, would think she'd found someone special. If she was lucky, someone would warn her. Someone would tell her about Melissa, about the violence, about what Brandon was capable of. If she was unlucky, she'd find out for herself. Because abusers don't stop. They just find new victims and start the cycle again. That was the lesson Melissa had learned too late. That love can be dangerous, that intensity can be violence, that the person who makes you feel special can be the person who destroys you. She'd trusted Brandon. She'd believed him when he said he loved her, when he apologized after hitting her, when he promised he'd change. Those promises had been lies. All of them. And by the time she'd understood that, she'd already lost 2 years of her life and nearly died in his apartment while he sat calmly on the couch explaining to police that she'd attacked him first. Trust becomes the weapon when you give it to someone who sees your vulnerability as an opportunity rather than a responsibility. Melissa had survived learning that lesson. Not everyone does. Angela Morrison met Victoria Chun at a community art class in the fall of 2019. Angela was 42, recently divorced, trying to rebuild a social life after 15 years of marriage that had left her isolated and unsure of herself. Victoria was 38, confident and charismatic, someone who seemed to light up whatever room she entered. They became friends quickly. Victoria was attentive, interested in Angela's life, generous with compliments and support. She'd text Angela every morning with encouraging messages, would invite her to gallery openings and dinners, would make Angela feel valued and seen in ways she hadn't felt in years. "You're so much stronger than you realize," Victoria would tell her. "Your ex-husband really did a number on you, making you think you weren't capable or interesting. But you are. You're amazing." Angela blossomed under Victoria's attention. She started dressing differently, carrying herself with more confidence, believing that maybe she could build a life beyond the marriage that had defined her entire adult existence. 6 months into their friendship, the dynamic shifted. Victoria suggested they get an apartment together, split expenses, support each other as they both navigated single life. It made financial sense, Angela thought, and it would be nice to live with someone who understood her, who made her feel good about herself. The first few months of living together were wonderful. Victoria was a great roommate, clean, considerate, fun to be around. They'd have wine and long conversations about their lives, their dreams, their disappointments. Angela felt like she'd finally found someone who truly understood her. But gradually, things began to change. Victoria started making comments about Angela's other friendships, suggesting that certain people were toxic or using her. When Angela would make plans with former co-workers or friends from her marriage, Victoria would look hurt, would say she thought they were building something special together, that she felt abandoned when Angela chose other people over her. Angela started declining invitations, started spending more time at home with Victoria. It felt easier than dealing with the guilt and the sense that she was betraying their friendship by wanting other relationships. Then came the financial entanglement. Victoria suggested they merge some expenses, open a joint account for household bills. It would simplify things, she said, make managing their shared life easier. Angela agreed, not recognizing that she was giving Victoria control over her finances, not understanding that this was a trap closing around her. Victoria started managing more and more of Angela's life. She'd critique Angela's clothing choices, her eating habits, her decisions about how to spend her time. Every criticism was framed as helpful, as someone who loved Angela wanting her to be her best self. "I'm only saying this because I care about you," Victoria would say. "No one else is honest with you. Everyone else just lets you make mistakes." Angela started to doubt herself. Maybe Victoria was right. Maybe her judgment wasn't good. Maybe she needed someone to help her make better decisions. The isolation intensified. Victoria would get upset if Angela wanted time alone, would accuse her of pulling away, of not being committed to their friendship. She'd cry, would talk about how everyone else in her life had abandoned her, would make Angela feel responsible for her emotional well-being. Angela's family noticed the change. Her sister, Marie, tried to talk to her about it during a rare visit. "This friendship doesn't seem healthy," Marie said. "Victoria seems really controlling. The way she talks to you, the way she monopolizes your time. It reminds me of how Paul treated you during your marriage." Angela had gotten defensive. "Victoria is nothing like Paul. She actually cares about me, actually wants me to be happy. You just don't understand our friendship." But Marie's comparison had unsettled her. Was Victoria controlling? Or was Angela just oversensitive after years of actual abuse in her marriage? The sexual relationship began 6 months after they moved in together. Victoria initiated it, framed it as a natural evolution of their deep emotional connection. Angela was confused. She'd never been attracted to women before, had never imagined herself in a same-sex relationship. But Victoria was persuasive. "Love isn't about gender," she said. "It's about connection, about finding someone who truly sees you. Don't you feel more yourself with me than you ever did with Paul?" Angela did feel more herself. Or at least, she felt like Victoria made her feel valuable, interesting, worthy of attention. If that was love, then maybe this made sense. The relationship quickly became intense in ways that felt both thrilling and suffocating. Victoria wanted constant access to Angela, physically, emotionally, financially. She'd check Angela's phone, would question her about where she'd been and who she'd talked to, would become upset if Angela didn't respond to texts immediately. Angela recognized these behaviors. She'd experienced them in her marriage. But somehow it felt different with Victoria, felt like care rather than control. Or maybe she'd just gotten so used to this kind of treatment that she didn't know how to recognize it anymore. The physical abuse started small. A shove during an argument, rough handling during sex, grabbing Angela's arm hard enough to leave bruises. Victoria would always apologize afterward, would say she'd just been overcome with passion or frustration, would promise to be more gentle. Angela stayed because leaving felt impossible. Victoria controlled their apartment, their shared finances, most of Angela's social connections. She'd systematically isolated Angela until there was nowhere to go, no one to turn to. And there was something else, shame. Angela had spent years telling people she'd escaped an abusive marriage, had presented her divorce as liberation. How could she admit that she'd walked directly into another abusive relationship? How could she explain that the friend who'd seemed to save her had actually trapped her in something worse? Marie tried to intervene again when she saw bruises on Angela's arms during a family dinner. Angela claimed she'd fallen, that she was just clumsy. Marie didn't believe her, but didn't know what to do. Angela was an adult. She couldn't be forced to leave a relationship she insisted was fine. But it wasn't fine. It was deteriorating rapidly. Victoria's violence escalated. She'd hit Angela during arguments, would punch walls beside her head, would destroy Angela's belongings when she was angry. She'd apologize afterward, would cry and say she was just so afraid of losing Angela, that her abandonment issues from childhood made her react badly. Angela found herself managing Victoria's emotions constantly, trying to prevent outbursts, walking on eggshells in her own home. It was exactly like her marriage had been, except somehow more confusing because everyone around her seemed to think same-sex relationships were inherently safer, inherently more equal. The final assault happened on a Tuesday night in March. They'd been arguing about Angela wanting to visit her sister for the weekend. Victoria didn't want her to go, said she needed Angela there, that choosing her sister over her was a betrayal. "You're always trying to leave me," Victoria screamed. "You're just like everyone else. I'm just visiting my sister for 2 days. I'll come back." Victoria hit her hard enough to knock her down. Then she was on top of Angela, hands around her throat, squeezing. Angela couldn't breathe, couldn't scream, could only claw at Victoria's hands while her vision started to blur. Victoria stopped just before Angela lost consciousness. She scrambled backward, horrified by what she'd almost done, but Angela was already moving. She grabbed her phone, locked herself in the bathroom, and called 911. Police arrived to find Angela barricaded in the bathroom with visible marks on her throat. Victoria was in the living room, crying, claiming that Angela had attacked her first, that she'd only been defending herself. The responding officers struggled with the situation. They'd been trained to recognize domestic violence in heterosexual relationships, but a same-sex couple presented complications they weren't sure how to handle. Who was the aggressor? Who was the victim? Could women even commit serious domestic violence against each other? Angela's injuries made the decision for them. The bruises on her throat, the terror in her eyes, the way she flinched when Victoria tried to approach her. It was clear who'd been hurt and who'd done the hurting. Victoria was arrested and charged with aggravated assault. The case exposed how unprepared the legal system was to handle same-sex domestic violence. Victoria's defense attorney argued that the relationship had been mutually toxic, that Angela had been equally violent, that this was a case of two people in an unhealthy dynamic rather than clear-cut abuse. The prosecutor pushed back. Angela had documented evidence of escalating abuse. Text messages where Victoria had threatened her, photos of bruises from previous assaults, testimony from Angela's sister about the changes she'd noticed. But the cultural narrative around same-sex relationships created complications. People assumed that without a man involved, the power dynamics must be equal, that abuse must be mutual. They couldn't conceive of a woman systematically controlling and terrorizing another woman the way Victoria had done to Angela. The trial became a referendum on whether domestic violence could exist in same-sex relationships. Victoria's defense team presented expert witnesses who talked about how lesbian relationships often involved more emotional intensity, that what looked like abuse might just be cultural differences in how women related to each other. Angela had to testify about every instance of abuse, had to describe the isolation and control and violence in explicit detail. She had to defend her victimhood against people who insisted that as a woman, she should have been able to fight back, to leave, to protect herself. The jury struggled with the case. Some members bought into the defense's narrative that this was a toxic relationship rather than abuse. Others recognized the pattern of control and violence regardless of the genders involved. After 3 days of deliberation, they returned a verdict: guilty of assault, but not aggravated assault. The jury believed Victoria had hurt Angela, but couldn't agree that it rose to the level of serious domestic violence. Victoria was sentenced to 3 years in prison, serving 18 months before being released on parole. The sentence felt inadequate to Angela, felt like confirmation that her abuse hadn't been taken seriously because it didn't fit expected patterns. If Victoria had been a man, she believed, the sentence would have been longer, the crime would have been treated more severely. But she'd gotten some measure of justice, which was more than many domestic violence victims achieved. Angela spent years rebuilding her life after Victoria's conviction. She moved back in with her sister temporarily, started therapy specifically focused on domestic violence trauma, and worked to understand how she'd ended up in another abusive relationship so soon after escaping her marriage. Her therapist helped her see the pattern. Angela had been vulnerable after her divorce, had been desperate for validation and connection. Victoria had recognized that vulnerability and exploited it, had used the same control tactics Paul had used but disguised them as friendship and support. Abusers recognize victims, her therapist explained. They can sense who's been conditioned to accept control, who'll make excuses for bad behavior, who'll stay even when things get dangerous. Gender doesn't matter. The dynamics are the same. That realization was both devastating and liberating. Angela had blamed herself for choosing badly, for not recognizing red flags, for being stupid enough to end up in the same situation twice. But understanding that she'd been targeted, that her vulnerability had been used against her, shifted the blame where it belonged, onto the people who'd abused her. She became an advocate for recognizing domestic violence in LGBTQ+ relationships. She spoke at training sessions for police and social workers, explaining how abuse looked the same regardless of gender, how the isolation and control and violence followed identical patterns. People assume same-sex relationships are safer, she'd tell audiences. They assume that without a man involved, there's automatically more equality. But abuse isn't about physical strength or gender. It's about power and control. And anyone can use power and control to hurt someone they claim to love. The case prompted some domestic violence organizations to revise their materials to be more inclusive, to explicitly acknowledge that abuse happened in all types of relationships. But many resources still focused primarily on male abusers and female victims, still operated on assumptions that didn't account for Angela's experience. Victoria was released from prison after 18 months. She immediately began posting on social media about how she'd been wrongly convicted, how the legal system had discriminated against her, how Angela had manipulated everyone into believing lies. Angela got a restraining order, moved to a different city, changed her phone number. She couldn't control Victoria's narrative, but she could control her own safety. Years later, a journalist working on an article about domestic violence and same-sex relationships contacted Angela. They'd found 3 other women who'd been in relationships with Victoria, all of whom described similar patterns of control, isolation, and violence. Victoria had been doing this for years. Angela hadn't been her first victim, wouldn't be her last. She was a serial abuser who moved from relationship to relationship, targeting vulnerable women, using the same tactics every time. The journalist asked if Angela wanted to participate in the article. She agreed, using her real name, refusing to hide anymore. The story ran in a major magazine, detailing Victoria's pattern of abuse and the systemic failures that allowed her to continue hurting people. The article sparked conversations about how domestic violence resources needed to be more inclusive, how law enforcement needed better training, how society needed to stop assuming that certain types of relationships were inherently safer than others. But it didn't stop Victoria. Last anyone heard, she was in a new relationship, had moved to a different state, was starting the cycle all over again with someone who didn't know her history. Because that's what abusers do. They move on. They find new victims. They adapt their tactics just enough to avoid consequences. Angela had survived, But survival wasn't the same as justice. Victoria was free, was able to hurt other people, was facing no ongoing consequences for the years of abuse she'd inflicted. The case had exposed an uncomfortable truth, that the systems designed to protect domestic violence victims were built on assumptions about gender that didn't account for all the ways abuse actually happened. That resources were inadequate for LGBTQ+ victims, that law enforcement was underprepared to handle same-sex domestic violence, that cultural stereotypes about women being nurturing and non-violent prevented people from recognizing abuse when it didn't fit expected patterns. Angela's story mattered because it challenged those assumptions, because it forced people to confront the fact that danger didn't always come from where they expected, that abuse didn't have a gender requirement, that victims needed support regardless of who was hurting them. She'd trusted Victoria, had believed that their friendship was genuine, that Victoria's attention was loving rather than controlling, that being in a relationship with a woman meant being safer than she'd been with her ex-husband. All of those beliefs had been wrong. Victoria had seen Angela's vulnerability and used it, had isolated her systematically, had controlled her finances and her social life, had escalated to physical violence exactly the way abusers always did. The only difference was that people had been slower to recognize it, slower to intervene, slower to take it seriously because it didn't match their mental image of what domestic violence looked like. That delay had nearly cost Angela her life. She'd survived only because she'd had just enough contact with her sister to call for help, had locked herself in a bathroom quickly enough to avoid being killed, had found police officers who believed her even when they were confused about how to handle the situation. She'd been lucky. Not everyone was. Domestic violence killed people every day. Sometimes those victims were women killed by male partners. Sometimes they were men killed by female partners. Sometimes they were LGBTQ+ individuals killed by partners of the same gender. The common factor wasn't gender. It was power, control, and the willingness to use violence to maintain both. Angela understood that now. Understood that her vulnerability had made her a target, that Victoria's charm had been a tool for manipulation, that the friendship she believed was saving her had actually been destroying her. Trust, once again, had been the weapon. Angela had trusted that leaving an abusive marriage meant escaping abuse. Had trusted that a same-sex relationship would be different, safer, more equal. Had trusted Victoria when she presented herself as supportive and caring. Every one of those trusts had been betrayed. And the systems that were supposed to protect her, the police, the courts, the domestic violence resources, had struggled to recognize her abuse because it didn't fit their templates, didn't match their assumptions about who abused whom. She'd survived anyway, had fought her way free, had testified, had gotten Victoria convicted despite all the obstacles. But it shouldn't have been that hard. It shouldn't have required her nearly dying before people took it seriously. It shouldn't have taken a pattern of multiple victims before anyone recognized Victoria as dangerous. The warning signs had been there from the beginning. The intensity of Victoria's attention, the isolation from friends and family, the financial control, the emotional manipulation. All the same signs that had been present in Angela's marriage to Paul. But Angela had been desperate for connection, had been vulnerable and lonely and willing to overlook red flags because Victoria had made her feel special, valued, seen. That desperation had nearly killed her. She knew better now. Knew that intensity wasn't intimacy, that isolation wasn't protection, that someone who truly loved you didn't need to control every aspect of your life. But knowing that intellectually didn't erase the trauma, didn't make the nightmares stop, didn't undo the years of abuse she'd endured. Angela would spend the rest of her life dealing with the aftermath of trusting Victoria, would spend years in therapy, would struggle with PTSD, would have difficulty forming new relationships because trust had been shattered so completely. Victoria had stolen years of Angela's life, had damaged her psychologically in ways that might never fully heal. And she'd gotten 18 months in prison for it. The injustice of that was staggering. But it was also reality. The legal system had limits. Domestic violence sentences were often inadequate, and abusers rarely faced consequences proportional to the harm they caused. Angela had to live with that. Had to accept that justice was incomplete, that Victoria would never truly pay for what she'd done, that the best Angela could hope for was to rebuild her life and try to prevent other people from suffering the same fate. She did that work, became an advocate, educated people, shared her story even when it was painful and exposing. Because if her suffering could prevent even one other person from being victimized by someone like Victoria, then maybe it meant something. Maybe it wasn't just senseless trauma. Maybe it could be transformed into purpose. That transformation didn't erase the pain, but it made the pain bearable. Angela survived. That had to be enough. Because sometimes survival is the only victory available, and you have to find a way to make peace with that. Victoria Chun was still out there. Still charming vulnerable women. Still building intensity into control. Still using friendship as a cover for abuse. Somewhere, someone was probably falling for her right now. Believing her promises, trusting her attention, thinking they'd found someone special. And they wouldn't know the truth until it was too late. Until they were isolated and controlled and scared. Until they were fighting for their life in an apartment while Victoria's hands closed around their throat. Unless someone warned them. Unless someone recognized the pattern. Unless the systems designed to protect abuse victims actually worked the way they were supposed to. Angela hoped they'd be luckier than she'd been. Hoped they'd recognize the danger sooner, escape faster, get help more easily. But hope wasn't a strategy. And trust was still the weapon that abusers used most effectively. As long as people believed that certain relationships were inherently safe, that certain people couldn't be abusers, that certain patterns didn't qualify as violence, predators like Victoria would keep finding victims. And those victims would keep suffering in silence, unable to name what was happening to them, unable to get help because their abuse didn't fit expected narratives. Angela's story had changed some of that, had opened some eyes, had prompted some reforms. But not enough. Never enough. The work continued. The education continued. The fight to expand understanding of what domestic violence looked like, who could be victims, who could be abusers, that fight continued. Because trust would always be a weapon as long as people were willing to use it to hurt others. And there would always be people willing to do that. Angela had learned that lesson the hard way. Twice. She wouldn't make that mistake again. Marcus Webb had been in and out of the criminal justice system since he was 16 years old. His record read like a timeline of escalating violence, petty theft, assault, armed robbery, sexual assault. He'd served time, been released, violated parole, been sent back. The pattern had repeated itself for 18 years. The Department of Corrections had thick files on Marcus, psychological evaluations that identified him as a high risk for reoffending, parole violation reports documenting his inability to comply with supervision requirements, incident reports from inside prison describing his violent behavior toward other inmates. Everyone who reviewed Marcus's case agreed on one thing. He was dangerous and would almost certainly commit more crimes if released. Then he was released anyway. The parole board's decision came down to mathematics rather than safety. Prison overcrowding meant they needed to free up beds. Marcus had served his minimum sentence for his most recent conviction. His parole hearing presentation had been coached by a jailhouse lawyer who'd taught him what to say to sound reformed. "I take full responsibility for my past actions," Marcus had told the board. "I've used my time in prison to work on myself, to understand why I made the choices I made. I've completed anger management programs and substance abuse treatment. I'm ready to be a productive member of society." The parole board had heard these speeches before. They knew most of them were performative, that recidivism rates for violent offenders were high, that rehabilitation was more promise than reality for many inmates. But the prisons were overcrowded. They needed to release someone. Marcus had checked enough boxes to make his release defensible if anyone questioned it later. So they released him. His parole conditions were extensive. He had to report to a parole officer weekly, maintain employment, avoid contact with known criminals, stay away from drugs and alcohol, observe a curfew, and wear an ankle monitor that tracked his location. Marcus complied for exactly 3 weeks. Then he stopped going to his required check-ins. Stopped maintaining the construction job his parole officer had helped him find. Started hanging around his old neighborhood with the same people who'd been involved in his previous crimes. His parole officer filed violation reports, requested that Marcus be picked up and returned to custody. But the system was backlogged, understaffed, overwhelmed with cases. The warrant for Marcus's arrest went into a queue with thousands of others, waiting for officers to have time to track him down. Meanwhile, Marcus was free, escalating, becoming more dangerous with each day he wasn't held accountable. Jennifer Cow was 28 years old, a nurse who worked night shifts at County General Hospital. She lived alone in a modest apartment, was saving money to buy a house, talked to her parents in Taiwan every Sunday via video call. She had no connection to Marcus Webb, had never met him, had no mutual acquaintances, existed in a completely different social world. But none of that mattered when their paths crossed on a Thursday night in September. Jennifer was walking home from the bus stop after her shift ended at midnight. It was a route she'd walked hundreds of times, through a neighborhood she considered reasonably safe. She had her keys ready, her phone in her hand, was aware of her surroundings the way women are taught to be. Marcus was standing in an alley between two buildings, drinking from a bottle in a paper bag despite his parole conditions prohibiting alcohol. He saw Jennifer walking alone and made a decision that took maybe 3 seconds of thought. He followed her. Jennifer noticed him after half a block. She walked faster, considered crossing the street, but they were approaching her apartment building, and she didn't want to lead him away from the safety of home. She should have crossed the street, should have kept walking, should have called 911 right then. But Jennifer was tired after a 12-hour shift. She was 200 feet from her front door. She made a calculation that seemed reasonable. She could get inside before he caught up to her. She was wrong. Marcus grabbed her just as she was reaching for the door to her building. He had one hand over her mouth, the other arm around her waist, was dragging her backward into the shadows. Jennifer fought. She'd taken a self-defense class years ago, tried to remember the techniques they'd taught. She bit his hand, tried to scream when he pulled it away, scratched at his face. Marcus hit her hard enough to stun her, then dragged her into the alley beside her building. What happened next took less than 10 minutes, but would destroy multiple lives. Marcus sexually assaulted Jennifer while she begged him to stop, while she promised she wouldn't tell anyone, while she tried to stay conscious through the pain and terror. When he was finished, he strangled her. Not in a moment of passion or panic, but methodically, deliberately, because leaving a witness alive was a risk he couldn't take. Jennifer Cow died in that alley while her phone buzzed with a text from her mother asking if she'd gotten home safely. A resident discovered her body at 6 in the morning, called police, and triggered an investigation that would eventually expose every failure in the system that had allowed Marcus to be on that street. The DNA evidence collected from Jennifer's body matched Marcus within 48 hours. He was already in the system, his genetic profile on file from previous convictions. Police had his current address from parole records, except he hadn't been there in weeks, had been staying with various friends and associates while avoiding his parole officer. They found him 3 days later at a girlfriend's apartment. He initially denied everything, then tried to claim the sex had been consensual, that Jennifer had attacked him and he'd defended himself. The physical evidence told a different story. Jennifer's injuries, the location of her body, the timeline of events, all of it contradicted Marcus's version. He was charged with first-degree murder, sexual assault, and multiple parole violations. The case became a media sensation not because of anything unique about the crime itself, but because of what it revealed about systemic failures. The parole board that had released a violent offender despite clear evidence he'd reoffend. The parole supervision system that had been too overwhelmed to respond when he violated conditions. The warrant system that had been too backlogged to pick him up before he killed someone. Jennifer's parents flew in from Taiwan for the trial. They sat in the courtroom every day, listening to testimony about their daughter's final moments, looking at the man who'd killed her. Through an interpreter, Jennifer's mother gave a victim impact statement that left everyone in the courtroom in tears. "My daughter was a healer," she said. "She spent her life taking care of sick people, making them better. She was good and kind, and she never hurt anyone. And she died because your system decided a violent criminal deserved freedom more than she deserved safety." The prosecutor presented evidence of every decision that had led to Jennifer's death. The parole board hearing where multiple members had expressed concerns about releasing Marcus but had been overruled by the need to reduce prison population. The violation reports that had been filed but not acted on. The warrant that had been issued but never served. The defense had no real argument. Marcus's guilt was indisputable. His attorney could only argue against the death penalty, could only ask for mercy that Marcus had never shown to any of his victims. The jury convicted him on all counts in less than 2 hours. The penalty phase took longer. The prosecutor argued that Marcus had proven repeatedly that he couldn't be reformed, that he was a danger to society, that the only way to protect the public was to ensure he never walked free again. Marcus's attorney presented witnesses who testified about his difficult childhood, his struggles with addiction, his mental health issues. They argued that life in prison was sufficient punishment, that execution was unnecessary. The jury sentenced Marcus Webb to death. He was placed on death row, where he'd likely spend decades in appeals before any execution was carried out. In the meantime, he was removed from society permanently, unable to hurt anyone else. But that didn't bring Jennifer back. Her parents created a foundation in her name that provided scholarships for nursing students and funded victim advocacy programs. They couldn't save their daughter, but they could honor her memory by helping others. The parole system underwent reforms after Jennifer's death. New guidelines were implemented for releasing violent offenders. Additional resources were allocated to parole supervision. The warrant backlog was addressed with emergency funding. All changes that should have happened before Jennifer died, that might have saved her life if they'd been in place 6 months earlier. But reform always comes too late for the victims who prompted it. Jennifer's colleagues at the hospital created a memorial garden in her honor. Patients she'd cared for wrote letters about her kindness and competence. Friends shared stories about her sense of humor, her dedication to her family, her plans for the future. All the things that Marcus had stolen when he decided her life mattered less than his momentary urges. The case prompted discussions about criminal justice reform, about balancing public safety with prison overcrowding, about how to identify which offenders could safely be released and which ones posed too much risk. But those discussions rarely led to clear answers. The system was overwhelmed, underfunded, trying to manage problems that had no simple solutions. Meanwhile, people like Marcus cycled through, getting arrested, getting convicted, serving time, getting released, reoffending. Each cycle created new victims, new families destroyed by violence that should have been prevented. Jennifer had done nothing wrong. She'd worked hard, lived responsibly, taken reasonable precautions for her safety. She'd just had the misfortune of being in the same place at the same time as a violent offender who should have been in custody. The randomness of it was crushing. If Jennifer had worked a different shift, if Marcus had been picked up on his parole violation warrant a week earlier, if any of 1,000 small variables had been different, she'd still be alive. But those variables had aligned in exactly the wrong way, and now Jennifer was dead and Marcus was on death row and her parents were in Taiwan trying to figure out how to live in a world without their daughter. The system apologized. Officials gave statements about how tragic the situation was, how they were committed to reforms, how this should never have happened. But apologies didn't resurrect the dead. Reforms didn't undo violence. Commitment to doing better next time didn't help the families grieving now. Jennifer Cow had trusted that the criminal justice system would protect her, that violent offenders wouldn't be released unless they were safe, that parole violations would be taken seriously, that warnings would be acted on. All of those trusts had been betrayed by a system too overwhelmed to function properly, too understaffed to respond quickly, too focused on managing prison populations to prioritize public safety. She'd paid for those failures with her life. Marcus Webb gave one interview from death row 5 years after his conviction. He claimed to be a changed man, said he'd found God, that he thought about Jennifer every day and wished he could take back what he'd done. The interviewer asked if he'd known he was going to kill her when he grabbed her that night. Marcus had paused, then answered with uncomfortable honesty. "I didn't think about it," he said. "I saw her and I wanted her, and I took what I wanted. Killing her was just cleanup, making sure she couldn't identify me. I wasn't thinking about her as a person with a family and a life. She was just an obstacle I needed to get rid of." That dehumanization was at the core of Marcus's violence. He'd never seen his victims as people, had only seen them as objects to use and discard. Rehabilitation would have required developing empathy he'd never possessed, developing a conscience that had never constrained his behavior. The parole board had released him anyway, had convinced themselves that his performance of reformation was genuine, had prioritized reducing prison population over protecting the public. Jennifer had died because of that decision. Her story wasn't unique. Every year, parolees committed serious crimes that could have been prevented if they'd remained in custody. Every year, families grieved loved ones who'd been killed by people the system had released despite knowing they were dangerous. The problem was structural. Prisons were overcrowded because incarceration rates were high and sentences were long. Parole boards were pressured to release inmates to make room for new ones. Supervision systems were understaffed and unable to monitor all the parolees effectively. Something had to give. Usually, what gave was public safety. Jennifer's parents never forgave the system that had failed their daughter. They attended every parole reform hearing, testified about Jennifer's death, fought to make sure other families didn't suffer the same loss. Their advocacy led to some changes. Stricter oversight of parole decisions for violent offenders. Better funding for parole supervision. Faster response to violation reports. But the fundamental problems remained. Too many people in prison, too few resources to manage them, too much pressure to release inmates before they were ready. The cycle continued. People like Marcus moved through the system, accumulating victims, until finally they did something so terrible that permanent incarceration became unavoidable. Jennifer had been that final terrible thing for Marcus. The crime that was too extreme to explain away, too well documented to deny, too brutal to excuse. But she shouldn't have had to be. The warning signs had been there for years. The pattern of escalating violence had been clear. Everyone who reviewed Marcus's file knew he was dangerous. They'd released him anyway, and Jennifer had paid the price. Her death was preventable in the most literal sense. If the parole board had made a different decision, if the parole officer's violation reports had been acted on immediately, if the warrant system had been functional, Jennifer would have walked home safely that night. Instead, she'd encountered a violent offender who should have been in custody, and it had cost her everything. The trust Jennifer had placed in the system to protect her had been betrayed. Not through malice or corruption, but through the grinding dysfunction of institutions trying to manage impossible caseloads with inadequate resources. That made it no less deadly. Jennifer's apartment building installed better lighting and security cameras after her death. The bus company rerouted the late-night line, so fewer people had to walk through isolated areas. The neighborhood watch program became more active. All measures that might have helped if they'd been in place before Jennifer died. But they were too late for her. Her room at her parents' house in Taiwan remained exactly as she'd left it during her last visit. Her mother couldn't bring herself to change anything, to accept that Jennifer would never come home again. Every Sunday, they still made the video call, but now it was to her voicemail, just to hear her voice on the recording, just to maintain the ritual even though she'd never answer. Jennifer had been planning to visit them in December, had already bought her ticket, had been excited about spending the holidays with them for the first time in 3 years. Marcus had stolen that too. Had stolen every future moment, every plan, every dream Jennifer had been working toward. For what? 10 minutes of violence that had satisfied his urges and ended a life. The mathematics of it were obscene. 28 years of Jennifer's existence, all the love and investment and hope her parents had poured into raising her, all her education and career and relationships, all of it destroyed in the time it took Marcus to assault and murder her. And the system that should have prevented it had known he was dangerous, had documented his escalating violence, had been warned repeatedly that he was violating parole. But the warnings hadn't been enough. The documentation hadn't mattered. The knowledge that he was dangerous hadn't translated into action fast enough. Jennifer Cow had done everything right and died anyway. That was the lesson her death taught. That being careful wasn't enough. That trusting the system to function wasn't enough. That there were failures beyond individual control, systemic problems that put everyone at risk. Marcus had been one person. But how many others like him were being released every day, were violating parole without immediate consequences, were moving through communities while everyone assumed the system was tracking them? The answer was unknowable and terrifying. Jennifer's colleagues started a campaign for better lighting in hospital parking areas and for security escorts for staff working late shifts. They couldn't bring Jennifer back, but they could try to protect others. The hospital administration agreed to the changes. They renamed the parking lot in Jennifer's honor, installed a memorial plaque, made sure every employee knew her story. So that maybe someone else would be more careful. Maybe someone else would call for that security escort. Maybe someone else would make it home safely because they remembered what had happened to Jennifer. Her death became a cautionary tale, a reminder that danger existed, that precautions mattered, that the world wasn't safe just because you wanted it to be. But it should have been more than a cautionary tale. It should have been a catalyst for fundamental reform of systems that were failing to protect the public. Some changes happened. Most didn't. The problems were too big, too expensive to fix, too politically complicated to address comprehensively. So people continued to die, continued to be victimized by offenders who should have been in custody, continued to pay the price for systemic failures with their lives. And their families continued to grieve, to demand justice, to fight for reforms that always came too late to save their loved ones. Jennifer's parents would spend the rest of their lives doing that work, fighting to make sure the system that had failed their daughter didn't fail others, trying to create meaning from senseless violence, attempting to transform their grief into something that might prevent future tragedies. It wouldn't bring Jennifer back. Nothing would. But it was all they could do. All any victim's family could do. Try to make the tragedy matter. Try to force change from broken systems. Try to ensure their loved one's death wasn't completely meaningless. Jennifer Cow deserved better than to be a catalyst for reform. She deserved to have lived, to have built the career she'd been working toward, to have bought that house she'd been saving for, to have grown old with family and friends who loved her. Marcus Webb had stolen all of that, and the system that released him had made it possible. Trust in institutions to protect public safety had killed Jennifer as surely as Marcus's hands around her throat. Because trust only works when the systems you trust are functional, when the warnings are heeded, when the protocols are followed, when public safety is prioritized over bureaucratic convenience. None of that had been true in Jennifer's case. She'd trusted that violent offenders wouldn't be released prematurely. She'd trusted that parole violations would be addressed quickly. She'd trusted that the system was working to keep dangerous people off the streets. All of those trusts had been betrayed, and she died walking home from work on a route she'd taken hundreds of times before, killed by a man who should have been in custody, in a tragedy that every official agreed was preventable, but that no one had prevented. That was the horror at the center of her story. Not that evil existed, everyone knew that. Not that random violence happened, everyone knew that too. The horror was that the violence hadn't been random. It had been predictable, documented, avoidable. And it had happened anyway because the systems designed to prevent it had failed. Jennifer Cow had walked into that failure, and it had killed her. Her parents would never stop mourning, never stop fighting for reforms, never stop wondering if their daughter's life could have been saved if someone, somewhere in the system, had just done their job. The answer was yes. It could have been saved, but it wasn't. And that knowledge would haunt everyone involved for the rest of their lives. Except Marcus, who'd stopped thinking about Jennifer years ago. He was on death row, would eventually be executed, and had already moved on to other concerns. Jennifer was just another victim in a long line of people he'd hurt. She'd been a person to everyone who loved her. To Marcus, she'd been an opportunity and then an obstacle. That was the difference between victims and perpetrators. Victims' families lived with the loss forever. Perpetrators moved on to the next thing. Jennifer Cow was gone. Her parents grieved. The system apologized. And somewhere else, another violent offender was being released on parole despite warnings they weren't ready. Another potential victim was going about their daily life, trusting that the system was keeping them safe. Another tragedy was waiting to happen, preventable but not prevented. The cycle continued. Trust remained the weapon, and the body count kept rising. The hotel room was on the 7th floor of a business hotel near the airport. Room 714 had been occupied for 3 nights by a woman traveling alone on business, a consultant who'd been attending meetings with clients in the city. Her name was Dr. Samantha Price, though she went by Sam to most people. She was 39 years old, held a PhD in organizational psychology, and ran a successful consulting firm that helped companies improve their workplace culture. Sam was supposed to check out on Thursday morning. When she didn't, when she missed her 11 a.m. checkout time, the hotel didn't think much of it. Guests overstayed all the time. They'd just charge her for an extra day. But when Sam missed her afternoon flight, when her colleague called the hotel asking if anyone had seen her because she wasn't answering her phone, when evening came and the room still showed as occupied, the manager decided to do a wellness check. They found Sam in the bathroom, dead for at least 12 hours. The scene was complicated in ways that made investigators immediately suspicious. Sam had been strangled, but there was also evidence of sexual assault. The room showed signs of both a struggle and of someone having tried to clean up afterward. Sam's laptop was missing, as was her phone and wallet. It looked like a robbery gone wrong, except some valuable items had been left behind. Her wedding ring was still on her finger. Her expensive watch was on the nightstand. Her designer luggage sat unopened in the closet. Someone had taken specific items and left others, suggesting this wasn't a random theft. The hotel's security footage became crucial to the investigation. It showed Sam returning to the hotel around 9 p.m. on Wednesday night after her dinner meeting. She'd been alone, had seemed sober and steady, had smiled at the desk clerk as she collected her room key. At 10:17 p.m., the elevator footage showed two men getting off on the 7th floor. They'd walked down the hall in the direction of Sam's room. Neither was a registered guest. At 11:43 p.m., the same two men left the hotel through a side entrance. They'd been carrying a bag that looked like it might contain a laptop. The desk clerk from the late shift remembered seeing the two men in the lobby earlier that evening. They'd been sitting in the bar area, not drinking, just watching people come and go. She'd thought it was odd, but hadn't said anything. People used the lobby as a meeting place all the time. Police pulled the security footage from nearby businesses. They tracked the two men walking several blocks to a parking garage where they'd gotten into a car. The license plate was partially obscured, but traffic cameras picked up the vehicle heading north on the highway. The investigation became a manhunt. Sam's husband, David Price, flew in from their home in Seattle. He sat in a police conference room trying to make sense of what had happened. Sam had been cautious, smart, experienced at traveling for work. She'd stayed in hundreds of hotels, had followed all the safety protocols, had texted him that evening saying her meetings had gone well and she'd see him the next day. She would never have let strangers into her room, David said. She was careful about that. She wouldn't even order room service late at night because she didn't like having people at her door. So how had two men gotten into room 714? The hotel lock system showed that Sam's room key had been used to enter at 10:23 p.m. No other key had opened that door. Either Sam had let them in voluntarily, or they'd somehow obtained her key. Investigators interviewed everyone Sam had met with during her business trip. Clients, colleagues, restaurant staff. They built a timeline of her movements, looking for any connection to the two men seen on security footage. They found it in an unlikely place. One of the clients Sam had been meeting with was a mid-level manager at a logistics company. During their meeting on Wednesday afternoon, she'd mentioned where she was staying, what time her flight left the next day, that she'd be working from her hotel room that evening finishing her report. The manager, Richard Torres, had seemed friendly and professional. He'd asked Sam to send him some additional materials, had written down his email address for her. Investigators looked into Richard Torres and discovered he had a younger brother, Miguel, who had an extensive criminal record: theft, assault, drug offenses. Miguel had been released from prison 6 months earlier after serving 2 years for armed robbery. Richard's phone records showed he'd called Miguel twice on Wednesday evening. The first call happened during his meeting with Sam. The second happened an hour later. When police showed the hotel security footage to Richard's co-workers, 2 of them identified Miguel as one of the men seen entering the hotel. The second man was harder to identify, but cell phone tower data placed Miguel's known associate, a man named Vincent Shaw, in the area of the hotel at the time of Sam's murder. The theory of the crime began to take shape. Richard had shared information about Sam with his brother, where she was staying, that she'd be alone, that she was a high-paid consultant likely carrying expensive equipment. Miguel and Vincent had gone to the hotel to rob her. But something had gone wrong. Maybe Sam had resisted. Maybe they'd decided to assault her. Maybe the violence had escalated beyond what they'd planned. Or maybe they'd planned it all along, had known they'd need to kill her to avoid leaving a witness. Police located Miguel Torres 3 weeks after Sam's murder. He was arrested at his apartment, where investigators found Sam's laptop hidden in his closet. Vincent Shaw was arrested the same day at his girlfriend's house. Richard Torres was arrested for conspiracy and accessory to murder. He claimed he'd only mentioned where Sam was staying as casual conversation, that he'd never intended for his brother to rob her, that he had no idea they'd killed her. His phone records told a different story. After the first call to Miguel, Richard had sent a text: "Consultant, room 714, Marriott by airport, leaving tomorrow, probably working late." Then another, mentioned expensive computer, traveling alone. That was enough to establish conspiracy. The case against all 3 men was complicated by the lack of direct evidence. Sam's DNA was on Miguel's clothes, but he claimed they'd had consensual contact, that she'd invited him to her room. Vincent claimed he'd never been there at all, despite security footage clearly showing him entering the hotel. Richard maintained he'd just been making conversation with his brother, had never intended for Sam to be hurt. The forensic evidence told a clearer story. Sam had fought hard. She'd scratched both attackers, leaving their DNA under her fingernails. The pattern of her injuries indicated two different assailants. The attempted cleanup suggested they'd realized the seriousness of what they'd done and had tried to cover their tracks. The jury didn't buy any of the defense theories. The evidence was too compelling, the timeline too clear, the coordination between the three men too obvious. Miguel Torres was convicted of first-degree murder, sexual assault, and robbery. He was sentenced to life without parole. Vincent Shaw was convicted of the same charges and received the same sentence. Richard Torres was convicted of conspiracy to commit robbery and accessory to murder. He received 25 years. Sam's husband attended every day of the trial, sitting in the front row, making eye contact with the defendants, making sure they knew that Sam had been real, had been loved, had mattered. In his victim impact statement, David spoke about the life he and Sam had built together. "We'd been married for 12 years, he said. We were planning to adopt a child. Sam was finally at the point in her career where she could slow down, where we could focus on becoming parents. She was so excited about it." He looked at Richard Torres. "You told your brother where to find my wife. You gave him the information he needed to rob her. And when they killed her, you didn't come forward. You let us wonder for weeks what had happened, who had done this. You're as guilty as they are." Richard Torres looked away, refused to meet David's eyes. The case raised questions about hotel security, about the ease with which the killers had accessed the 7th floor, about whether better protocols might have prevented Sam's murder. The hotel chain implemented new security measures. Additional cameras, security personnel on guest floors at night, keycard access to elevator floors. Changes that might have saved Sam if they'd been in place earlier. Her consulting firm established a scholarship in her name for women pursuing degrees in organizational psychology. They created safety protocols for consultants traveling alone. They made sure every employee knew Sam's story, understood the risks, took precautions seriously. But Sam was still gone. David struggled with survivor's guilt, with the knowledge that he'd been safe at home while his wife was being murdered in a hotel room 3 states away. He replayed their last conversation, looking for any sign that something was wrong, any warning he'd missed. There hadn't been any. Sam had been fine. She'd been looking forward to coming home. She'd had no idea that a client had shared her information with a criminal, that 2 men were planning to rob her, that her business trip would end in her death. She'd trusted that hotels were safe, that business travel was routine, that following precautions was sufficient protection. But she'd been targeted by people who saw her as an opportunity, who'd obtained information about her from someone who should never have shared it, who'd entered her space with the intention of stealing from her, and had decided to kill her to avoid consequences. The randomness of it was devastating. If Sam had stayed in a different hotel, if Richard hadn't mentioned her to his brother, if Miguel and Vincent had decided the risk was too high, if any of 1,000 variables had been different, Sam would have caught her Thursday morning flight and gone home to her husband. Instead, she died alone in a hotel bathroom, while 2 men went through her belongings looking for anything worth stealing. The investigation had been complicated by the fact that there were 2 attackers, that the crime scene had been partially cleaned, that initial theories about the crime had been incorrect. Investigators had first assumed it was a random attack, someone who'd followed Sam from her business dinner or targeted her in the hotel bar. They'd spent days reviewing footage from restaurants and bars, interviewing staff, building timelines that led nowhere. Only when they'd connected Richard Torres to the case had the pieces started falling into place. That delay had allowed Miguel and Vincent to spend 3 weeks free, potentially planning other crimes, potentially creating other victims. The system had worked eventually, but not quickly enough to feel like justice. Sam's funeral was attended by hundreds of people, colleagues, former clients, friends from graduate school, family from across the country. Speaker after speaker talked about her brilliance, her kindness, her dedication to making workplaces better for everyone. All the potential she'd had, all the work she'd still planned to do, all the lives she would have touched, gone because 2 men had decided her laptop was worth killing for. The mathematics of it were obscene. Sam's expertise, her years of education and experience, her relationships and plans for the future, all of it erased for objects worth maybe a few $1,000s. Miguel and Vincent would spend the rest of their lives in prison, would never contribute anything positive to society, would be sustained at taxpayer expense for decades. Everyone lost. Sam lost her life. David lost his wife. The men who killed her lost their freedom. Society lost a talented professional who'd been working to make things better. And for what? For a laptop and a phone that were recovered anyway. That had been worth nothing in the end. Trust had been Sam's fatal mistake. She'd trusted that a business meeting was just a business meeting, that sharing her hotel information was harmless professional small talk, that the person she was consulting with wouldn't use that information against her. Richard Torres had betrayed that trust spectacularly, had shared information with his criminal brother knowing, or at least suspecting, what might happen. He claimed he hadn't known they'd hurt her, but he'd known enough to put his brother in contact with a vulnerable target, had known enough to provide details about her schedule and her room number. That knowledge made him complicit in her death. The case became an example in business travel safety training. Don't share specific hotel information with clients. Don't mention room numbers or schedules. Don't assume that professional contacts are safe contacts. All lessons that Sam had learned too late. Her death, like so many others, should have been preventable. The warning signs had been there. Richard's criminal connections, Miguel's history of violence, the pattern of behavior that should have flagged him as dangerous. But those signs hadn't been visible to Sam. She'd been consulting with a company that appeared legitimate, meeting with people who seemed professional, doing her job in ways that had always been safe before. She'd had no way of knowing that Richard Torres had a brother who'd rob and kill someone based on information Richard shared. No way of anticipating that a casual mention of where she was staying would be used to target her. The trust she'd placed in normal business protocols had killed her. And now she was gone, memorialized in scholarships and safety protocols and the grief of everyone who'd loved her. David Price never remarried. He said that Sam had been his person, that trying to replace her felt impossible and wrong. He kept her office in their home exactly as she'd left it, would sometimes sit there reading her notes and planning documents, trying to feel close to her. The adoption process they'd started died with Sam. David couldn't imagine raising a child alone, couldn't bear the idea of that child never knowing Sam, of trying to explain why they didn't have a mother. So he lived alone, did his own work, and visited Sam's grave every week to tell her about his life, to share the ordinary details she'd never hear, to maintain a connection across death. Miguel Torres and Vincent Shaw appealed their convictions multiple times. Every appeal was denied. They'd spend the rest of their lives in prison, would die there eventually, remembered only as the men who'd murdered Dr. Samantha Price. Richard Torres served his 25-year sentence. When he was finally released, he'd be an old man, his life effectively over, the best years stolen by his decision to share information with his criminal brother. He claimed he'd been reformed by prison, that he'd found God, that he thought about Sam every day. But David didn't care about Richard's reformation. He cared that his wife was dead, that their plans for the future had died with her, that he'd spend the rest of his life alone because Richard had made a phone call he couldn't take back. Sam's story ended in that hotel bathroom, but the impact rippled outward for years. Safety protocols changed. Business travelers became more cautious. Companies implemented better training. All changes that came too late for Sam, but that might save others. That was all her death could accomplish now. A warning to others. A lesson learned in blood. Trust had been the weapon. Professional courtesy had provided the opening. And two men with criminal records had done the rest. Dr. Samantha Price deserved better than to be a cautionary tale. She deserved the life she'd been building, the child she'd been planning to adopt, the future with David she'd been looking forward to. Instead, she was a memorial scholarship, a safety protocol, a story told in business travel training sessions. Another victim of violence that should have been prevented but wasn't. Another example of how trust in ordinary circumstances could become fatal. Another death that proved safety was an illusion and danger could come from anywhere, from anyone, at any time. The danger was never hidden. It was familiar. It came from business meetings and hotel lobbies and information shared in casual conversation. And no one saw it coming until it was too late. Every case began the same way. Someone trusted the wrong person and paid for it with their life. The daughter who murdered her parents for freedom. The wife who poisoned her husband for insurance money. The young man killed by strangers on a festival street. The woman erased by her religious family until she disappeared. The teenager beaten nearly to death by her boyfriend. The woman strangled by her girlfriend. The nurse murdered by a parolee who should have been in custody. The consultant killed by criminals who'd been given her information by someone she'd trusted professionally. Different circumstances, different relationships, different methods. But underneath, the pattern was always the same. Trust creating vulnerability. Familiarity creating opportunity. Closeness providing the means to destroy. The danger was never in the shadows. It was at the dinner table, in the bedroom, at business meetings, in church pews, on city streets. It wore familiar faces, spoke kind words, made promises it never intended to keep. These stories span years and locations, but they tell the same truth over and over. The most dangerous people are the ones we never think to fear. The ones who know our routines, our weaknesses, our hopes. The ones who can get close because we've invited them in. Family becomes the weapon when control is mistaken for love. Expertise becomes the weapon when knowledge is used to kill rather than heal. Public spaces become dangerous when territorial violence makes innocence irrelevant. Respectability becomes cover for systematic abuse. Intimacy becomes fatal when jealousy escalates unchecked. Identity assumptions hide abuse that doesn't fit expected patterns. Systems fail when warnings are documented but ignored. Professional courtesy becomes an opening for violence. Every case different in its details. Every case identical in its core truth. Trust is only as safe as the person you give it to. And sometimes, the person who seems safest is the one planning to destroy you. Before you drift off to sleep tonight, maybe take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Where are you watching from? And what time is it there? These stories matter because they're real, because they happen to real people, because the patterns they reveal are still playing out every day. The danger was never hidden. It was familiar, and that's why no one saw it coming. Sweet dreams, everyone. And remember, the monsters aren't under the bed. Sometimes they're sitting right across from you at breakfast.